In the soft glow of a spring morning in 1910, the Miller family gathered outside their modest white farmhouse in Oakwood, Massachusetts. The scent of lilacs hung in the air as they prepared for a photograph to commemorate young Thomas's 8th birthday. Photography was still something of a marvel then, not the casual everyday occurrence it would become in later decades. "Stand still now, Tommy," Mrs. Miller said, adjusting the collar of her son's Sunday best. A crisp white shirt, short pants, and suspenders. His shoes had been polished to a mirror shine the night before, a luxury afforded only on special occasions. The photographer, Mr. Stillman, a tall, gaunt man with spectacles that caught the morning light, fussed with his bulky camera mounted on a wooden tripod. He disappeared beneath the black cloth draped over the apparatus, emerging a moment later. "The light is perfect," he announced. "Now, young man, look straight at the camera and show me your best smile." Tommy, a serious child by nature, rarely smiled for photographs, but today was different. His father had promised him a special gift after the session, his very own pocket watch, a symbol of growing responsibility that he'd coveted since he'd seen his father's gleaming timepiece. "That's it," Mr. Stillman encouraged, as Tommy's face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Hold steady now." The camera's shutter clicked, freezing that moment in time, a moment that would remain undisturbed for nearly a century before revealing its secret. None of them noticed anything unusual that day. The glass plate negative was developed, and prints were made. One was framed and placed proudly on the mantelpiece in the Miller family home. Another was tucked into a family album, bound in leather with gold embossing. The Millers delighted in the image, little Tommy standing so proudly, so grown up, his smile capturing the innocence of childhood and the promise of the future. If anyone had looked closely at the shadow cast on the whitewashed wall behind Tommy, they might have noticed something odd. But in those days, shadows were just shadows, dark impressions left by obstacles to light, nothing more. And in the sepia-toned photograph, shadows were merely darker patches, details easily overlooked. The years passed. Tommy grew up in that house on Maple Street. He played with wooden toys and marbles, attended the one-room schoolhouse down the road, and gradually assumed more responsibilities around the family farm. When the Great War came, he enlisted like many young men his age, returning a changed man but alive, more fortunate than many of his childhood friends. He married his sweetheart, Eleanor, in 1922, and they had 3 children of their own. The photograph remained in the family album, occasionally viewed when reminiscing about simpler times but never scrutinized. The shadow remained unnoticed, or if noticed, unremarked upon. Tommy lived a full life, passing away peacefully in his sleep in 1982 at the age of 80. His children cleared out the old family home, distributing heirlooms and donating items of little sentimental value. The family album, along with numerous other artifacts, found its way to the Oakwood Historical Society, where it sat in an archive, cataloged but rarely examined. There it remained, gathering dust, until 2007, 97 years after that spring morning when a little boy smiled proudly for the camera. Dr. Emily Thornton sighed as she surveyed the boxes stacked in the small back room of the Oakwood Historical Society. As the newly appointed director of digital archiving, she had been tasked with the mammoth project of digitizing the Society's vast collection of historical photographs and documents. "We've only got through about a quarter of the collection," her assistant Marcus reported, pushing his glasses up his nose. A graduate student in historical preservation, Marcus had been invaluable in the painstaking work of carefully scanning each delicate photograph and document. "Well, let's keep at it," Emily replied, reaching for another album from the pile. "Some of these photographs haven't been viewed in decades. Imagine the stories they could tell." The album she selected was bound in faded red leather, its pages yellowed with age. According to the catalog, it had belonged to the Miller family, one of Oakwood's founding families. Emily carefully turned the brittle pages, revealing photographs of stern-faced men in suits, women in high-necked dresses, and children in their Sunday best. "Look at these," she murmured to Marcus. "The fashion, the formality. It's like looking through a window into another world." She paused at a photograph of a small boy standing in front of a farmhouse. Unlike many of the subjects in these early photographs who maintained rigid poses and solemn expressions, this child was smiling broadly. "This one's different," she noted, carefully removing it from the album to scan it. The caption, written in faded ink beneath the photo, read, "Thomas Miller, 8th birthday, May 12, 1910. Marcus glanced over her shoulder. He looks happy. Most kids back then had to stand still for so long they ended up looking miserable in photographs. Emily nodded, placing the photograph on the scanner. It's a good one. The composition, the lighting, whoever took this knew what they were doing. The scanner hummed to life, creating a high-resolution digital copy of the photograph. When the image appeared on the computer screen, Emily leaned forward to check the quality of the scan, a routine procedure she'd performed hundreds of times over the past weeks. But something about this image made her pause. She zoomed in on different parts of the photograph, her brow furrowing. "Marcus, come look at this," she said, her voice hushed. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. "What am I looking at?" "The boy's shadow," Emily said, pointing to the dark silhouette cast on the wall behind young Thomas Miller. "Look at it carefully, then look at the boy." Marcus stared at the screen, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. That doesn't make sense. The shadow on the wall didn't match the boy's posture. While Thomas stood straight, facing the camera with his arms at his sides, the shadow showed a figure with one arm raised, as if reaching out or pointing, and the shape of the shadow's head seemed wrong somehow, not quite matching the outline of the boy's neatly combed hair. Could it be a flaw in the photograph? Marcus suggested. Or maybe something to do with how the light was falling? Emily shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. Look at the other shadows in the image. The porch railing, the tree in the yard. They all fall naturally." She zoomed in further on the anomalous shadow. "This is something else." That evening, long after Marcus had gone home, Emily remained at her desk, the digitized image of Thomas Miller still on her screen. She had tried various image enhancement techniques, adjusting contrast and clarity to better see the details of the shadow. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that something was genuinely unusual about this photograph. The shadow seemed to belong to someone, or something, else entirely. Not just a slight discrepancy that could be explained by the angle of the sun or a quirk of early photography, but a fundamental mismatch. She saved her work and shut down the computer, but found she couldn't stop thinking about the image as she drove home to her apartment on the outskirts of town. The smiling boy and his incongruous shadow haunted her thoughts. That night, Emily dreamed of standing in front of an old farmhouse under a bright sun. A boy stood nearby, smiling at her, but when she looked at his shadow, it began to move independently, stretching and shifting until it pulled free from the boy entirely, becoming a dark silhouette that moved across the ground toward her. She awoke with a start, heart racing, the dream still vivid in her mind. Outside her window, a nearly full moon cast sharp shadows across her bedroom floor. She glanced at the digital clock. 3:17 a.m. Too early to get up, too unsettled to fall back asleep easily. Emily reached for her laptop on the bedside table and opened it, the screen's blue glow illuminating her face in the darkness. She navigated to the folder containing the day's scans and opened the image of Thomas Miller again. In the quiet of the early morning hours, staring at the photograph, she made a decision. This wasn't just an interesting historical curiosity. It was something more, something that deserved investigation. The next morning, she arrived at the Historical Society earlier than usual, determined to learn more about the photograph and the Miller family. The Society's archives included not just photographs, but journals, letters, newspaper clippings, and official records. If there was something unusual about Thomas Miller or his family, perhaps she could find clues in these documents. By the time Marcus arrived, she had already pulled several boxes of materials related to the Miller family. "You're here early," he commented, hanging up his jacket. "I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph," Emily admitted. "I want to learn more about Thomas Miller and his family." Marcus nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her fascination. "What's the plan?" "I'd like you to continue with the scanning project while I dig into these records," she said, gesturing to the boxes she'd gathered. "And I want to find out if there are any living descendants of the Miller family still in the area. Someone who might have family stories or other photographs." "I can help with that," Marcus offered. "My grandmother knows pretty much everyone who's been in Oakwood for more than a generation. I can ask her if she knows of any Millers still around." Emily smiled gratefully. "That would be great. Also, I'd like to get a second opinion on the photograph. Do you know if there's anyone at the university who specializes in early photography? Someone who might be able to tell us if there's a technical explanation for what we're seeing." "Professor Harmon in the art history department," Marcus suggested. "He did a whole series of lectures on early American photography last semester. I can reach out to him if you'd like." "Perfect," Emily said. already turning her attention to a leather-bound journal she'd found among the Miller family artifacts. For the next few hours, Emily immersed herself in the written records of the Miller family. Thomas's father, Joseph Miller, had been a moderately successful farmer who also served as the town's blacksmith. His mother, Sarah, came from a respected family in a neighboring town. They had 3 children, Thomas, born in 1902, and his younger sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Nothing in the family history suggested anything out of the ordinary. They were well regarded in the community, active in the local church, and seemed to lead quiet, hard-working lives typical of rural New England in the early 20th century. Emily found a newspaper clipping from May 1910, the same month as the photograph, mentioning that Thomas Miller had won a spelling competition at his school. Another from 1918 noted his enlistment in the Army during World War I. A wedding announcement from 1922 described his marriage to Eleanor Thompson. Birth announcements for their children followed in subsequent years. By all accounts, Thomas Miller had lived an ordinary, respectable life. He had taken over his father's blacksmith business, later expanding it into a small hardware store. As times changed, he died in 1982, survived by his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Nothing Emily found explained the anomalous shadow in the photograph. Around noon, Marcus returned from his lunch break with news. "I spoke with my grandmother," he said, setting down a paper bag containing sandwiches he'd brought back for both of them. "She says there's a Margaret Miller who lives in the retirement community on Elm Street. She would be Thomas's granddaughter, daughter of his eldest son, Joseph Jr. Emily looked up from the journal she'd been reading. "That's excellent news. Do you think your grandmother could introduce us?" "Already taken care of," Marcus replied with a smile. "She called Mrs. Miller, who said she'd be happy to talk with us. We can visit her tomorrow afternoon if that works for you." "Perfect," Emily said, reaching for one of the sandwiches. "Any word from Professor Harmon?" "He's interested," Marcus confirmed. "I sent him the digital copy of the photograph and he's going to take a look at it. He said he'd call you later today." As promised, Professor Harmon called late that afternoon. Emily put him on speakerphone so Marcus could hear the conversation. "Fascinating image," the professor began without preamble. "The quality is remarkably good for a photograph from 1910. Where did you say you found this?" "In an album donated to the Historical Society by the Miller family," Emily explained. "We're in the process of digitizing the collection." "Well, it's quite an interesting anomaly you've spotted," Professor Harmon continued. "I've examined several similar cases over the years. Photographs with inexplicable shadows or reflections that don't quite match the subjects." Emily leaned forward eagerly. "So you've seen this kind of thing before? Is there a technical explanation?" "Sometimes," the professor replied, his tone measured. "Early photography had many quirks and limitations. Double exposures, movement during long exposure times, peculiarities of lighting, all could create visual artifacts that might seem strange to modern eyes. But in this case," Emily prompted. There was a pause before Professor Harmon answered. "In this case, I'm not seeing any of the usual signs of technical anomalies. The photograph appears to be a single, clean exposure. The lighting is consistent throughout the image. There's no evidence of movement blur or double imaging." Another pause. "To be perfectly honest, I don't have a ready explanation for what we're seeing here." Emily and Marcus exchanged glances. "Would it be possible for me to examine the original photograph?" Professor Harmon asked. "Digital scans are useful, but sometimes there are details that can only be observed in the physical artifact." "Of course," Emily agreed. "We can bring it to your office at the university, or you're welcome to visit the Historical Society." "I'll come to you," the professor decided. "Tomorrow morning, if that's convenient. I'd like to bring a few specialized tools for examining the photograph." After arranging a time for the professor's visit, Emily hung up, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. The shadow anomaly was genuine enough to intrigue an expert in early photography, which validated her interest. But the lack of a straightforward explanation opened doors to possibilities that were both fascinating and disturbing. "What do you think it could be?" Marcus asked, voicing the question that hung in the air between them. Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." That night, Emily's dreams were troubled again. She stood in a darkened room, staring at the photograph of Thomas Miller mounted on a wall. As she watched, the image began to change. The boy remained fixed, still smiling his proud smile, but the shadow behind him writhed and shifted, stretching across the wall until it seemed to step out of the frame entirely. The shadow figure stood before her in 3 dimensions, a silhouette with no features save for a pair of eyes that gleamed in the darkness. It raised one arm, the same position as in the photograph, pointing not at her, but past her, towards something she couldn't see. Emily turned to look, but before she could discern what the shadow was indicating, she awoke, the dream dissolving into the gray light of dawn, filtering through her bedroom curtains. She lay still for a moment, her heart racing, then reached for her phone to set an alarm. It was earlier than she normally rose, but she knew she wouldn't fall back asleep now. Besides, there was much to do today. Professor Harmon's visit in the morning and the meeting with Margaret Miller in the afternoon. Perhaps by day's end, she would have answers to the questions that had begun to consume her thoughts. Professor Harmon arrived at the Historical Society precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying a leather case containing his equipment. He was older than Emily had expected, in his 70s, she guessed, with a shock of white hair and bushy eyebrows that seemed perpetually raised in an expression of scholarly inquiry. "Dr. Thornton, I presume," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you for bringing this intriguing case to my attention. It's not often I get to examine something truly unexplained these days." Emily led him to the workroom where she had set up a table with the original photograph, carefully removed from its album and placed on a clean white surface. "Marcus won't be joining us?" the professor asked, glancing around the room. "He'll be in later," Emily explained. "He's helping his grandmother bring Margaret Miller, Thomas's granddaughter, here this afternoon. We thought she might have family stories that could shed light on the photograph." Professor Harmon nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Historical context can be as revealing as technical analysis." He opened his case and began removing his equipment: a professional-grade magnifying glass, a portable UV light, several filters, and a digital microscope that connected to his tablet. For the next 2 hours, Emily watched as the professor methodically examined the photograph, taking measurements, capturing microscopic images of the paper and chemicals, and muttering to himself occasionally. His thoroughness was impressive, and Emily found herself increasingly curious about what he was finding. Finally, Professor Harmon straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I've completed my physical examination, and I can tell you several things with certainty." Emily waited expectantly. "First, this is unquestionably an authentic photograph from the early 20th century. The paper stock, the printing process, the aging patterns, all are consistent with photographs produced around 1910. He gestured to the image. "Second, there is no evidence whatsoever of tampering or manipulation of the image, either at the time it was created or subsequently." "So the shadow anomaly was present in the original photograph when it was taken?" Emily asked. "Yes, absolutely," the professor confirmed. "Whatever we're seeing here was captured by the camera at the moment of exposure." He peered at the photograph again. "The third point I can confirm is that this is not a double exposure or any other common photographic error of the period. The image is remarkably clean and well executed." Emily frowned slightly. "So what does that leave us with?" Professor Harmon carefully returned his equipment to his case before answering. "It leaves us with something I've encountered only a handful of times in my 40-year career. A genuine photographic anomaly that defies conventional explanation." "What are the possibilities?" Emily pressed. The professor hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "In my experience, when all technical explanations have been eliminated, what remains often falls into the realm of what some would call paranormal phenomena." Emily raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected the scholarly professor to venture into such territory. Noticing her expression, Professor Harmon smiled slightly. "I understand your skepticism, Dr. Thornton. I shared it for much of my career, but after examining hundreds of historical photographs, I've come to accept that some contain elements that cannot be explained by the physics and chemistry of photography as we understand them." "So you're suggesting what exactly?" Emily asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. "I'm suggesting several possibilities," the professor replied. "One is that the camera captured something present at the scene that was not visible to the human eye, what some in the paranormal field might call a spirit or entity. Another possibility is a phenomenon sometimes referred to as time slippage, where the photograph captures not just a single moment, but a blend of multiple moments, past or future." He must have seen the doubt in Emily's eyes because he added, "I know how this sounds, Dr. Thornton, but I've learned to keep an open mind. Sometimes the most remarkable discoveries come from examining the inexplicable with curiosity rather than dismissal." Emily nodded slowly. While she wasn't ready to embrace paranormal explanations, she had to admit that they had exhausted the conventional ones. Thank you for your thoroughness, Professor. It's given me a lot to think about. I'd be very interested to hear what you learn from the Miller family descendant, Professor Harmon said as he prepared to leave. Family histories often contain stories that might seem like mere superstition or folklore, but can provide valuable context for anomalies like this one. After the professor departed, Emily spent some time organizing her notes and preparing questions for Margaret Miller. She was careful to frame them in a way that wouldn't sound alarming or suggest anything supernatural. The last thing she wanted was to upset an elderly woman with wild theories about her grandfather's photograph. Marcus arrived shortly after noon, looking slightly harried. Sorry I'm late. The retirement home was serving lunch, and my grandmother insisted we wait until Mrs. Miller had finished eating before bringing her over. No problem, Emily assured him. Is she here now? Yes, they're in the reception area. My grandmother's showing her some of the recent acquisitions in the display case. He hesitated. I should warn you, Mrs. Miller is quite elderly. She's sharp mentally, but her hearing isn't great, so you might need to speak up. Emily nodded. Thanks for the heads up. Let's not keep them waiting. Margaret Miller proved to be a tiny woman with snow-white hair pulled back in a neat bun and alert blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Despite her advanced age, she was nearly 90, Emily learned. She moved with purpose, leaning only slightly on a carved wooden cane. So, you're interested in my grandfather's photograph, Mrs. Miller said after introductions were made, her voice surprisingly strong. Imagine that, all these years, and suddenly Tom Miller is the center of attention again. Emily smiled, immediately warming to the elderly woman's direct manner. We're digitizing the Historical Society's collection, and your grandfather's photograph caught our attention because of the quality and composition. It's quite striking. This wasn't entirely untrue, though it sidestepped the real reason for their interest. He was a handsome child, Mrs. Miller agreed as Marcus helped her into a chair in the small meeting room Emily had prepared. Though I never knew him as a boy, of course. He was already an old man by my standards when I was growing up, in his 60s. Do you have many memories of him? Emily asked, taking a seat across from Mrs. Miller. Oh yes, quite vivid ones. Grandfather was a wonderful storyteller. He would gather all the grandchildren around the fireplace on winter evenings and tell us the most marvelous tales. A fond smile crossed her wrinkled face. Some were traditional stories, of course, but others were his own inventions, or so we thought at the time. Something in her tone caught Emily's attention. What do you mean, or so we thought? Mrs. Miller's gaze grew distant, as if looking back through the decades. As I got older, I began to suspect that some of his most fantastical stories might have had kernels of truth to them, especially the ones about the Shadow Man. Emily and Marcus exchanged a quick glance. The Shadow Man? Emily repeated, trying to keep her voice casual. Yes, that was one of his recurring characters, Mrs. Miller explained. A mysterious figure who could slip between worlds by traveling through shadows. Grandfather claimed the Shadow Man had visited him several times throughout his life, beginning when he was a child. Emily's pulse quickened. Did he ever mention when the first visit occurred? Mrs. Miller thought for a moment. Yes, I believe he said it was on his 8th birthday. There was something special about that day. A gift he received, I think. A pocket watch from his father. He said the Shadow Man appeared to him that very afternoon, after the family celebrations. Emily struggled to maintain a neutral expression. That's interesting. We actually have a photograph that was taken on your grandfather's 8th birthday. She carefully placed the image before Mrs. Miller. Is this the one you remember? The elderly woman adjusted her glasses, peering at the photograph. Yes, that's the one. It used to hang in his study. I remember looking at it often as a child, thinking how different he looked as a boy. Did he ever mention anything unusual about this particular photograph? Emily asked, watching Mrs. Miller's face closely. The old woman looked up, her blue eyes suddenly sharp. You've noticed it too, haven't you? The shadow that doesn't match. Emily nodded, relieved that she didn't need to explain the anomaly. Yes, we noticed that. Did your grandfather ever talk about it? Not directly, Mrs. Miller said, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the photograph. But he would sometimes say that the Shadow Man had left his mark on him, a sign that only those who knew to look for it would ever see. She tapped the image. I always wondered if this was what he meant. What exactly did he say about the Shadow Man? Marcus asked, leaning forward with interest. What were these stories about? Mrs. Miller settled back in her chair, as if preparing for a lengthy tale. According to my grandfather, the Shadow Man first appeared to him on the afternoon of his 8th birthday. He had gone to his room to admire his new pocket watch. When he noticed that his shadow on the wall wasn't moving properly, it seemed to be making gestures he wasn't making. Emily felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. He said he watched, fascinated and terrified, as his shadow separated from him entirely and took the form of a man, tall and thin, with no distinguishable features except for eyes that somehow gleamed despite being made of shadow. Mrs. Miller continued. The figure spoke to him, though not with words exactly. Grandfather said it was more like having thoughts placed directly into his mind. What did the shadow man say? Emily asked quietly. That he had been watching Thomas for some time and had chosen him for a special purpose. That he existed in a world parallel to our own, a world of shadows that most people never perceived, and that he needed Thomas's help. Help with what? Marcus prompted when Mrs. Miller paused. The elderly woman shook her head slightly. That part of the story always changed. Sometimes Grandfather would say the shadow man needed help finding something that had been lost. Other times he claimed the shadow world was in danger and needed a champion from our world. The details varied, but the core remained the same. The shadow man had selected him as a kind of bridge between worlds. Emily considered this information. It could easily be dismissed as the imaginative tales of a man who enjoyed entertaining his grandchildren. Yet the anomalous shadow in the photograph gave her pause. Could there be some connection? Did your grandfather ever claim to see the shadow man again after that first encounter? She asked. Oh yes, many times throughout his life, Mrs. Miller replied. He said the shadow man would appear at pivotal moments, when he was leaving for war, on his wedding day, at the birth of each of his children. Not to interfere, just to observe. She paused, her expression thoughtful. The last time, according to Grandfather, was the week before he died. He told my mother that the shadow man had come to prepare him for his final journey. A silence fell over the room as they all contemplated this statement. Mrs. Miller, Emily said carefully, do you believe your grandfather's stories about the shadow man were real experiences, or do you think they were tales he created for entertainment? The elderly woman considered the question. As a child, I believed them completely. As a young woman, I decided they were merely stories. But now, in my old age, she looked down at the photograph again, at the mismatched shadow behind the smiling boy. I've come to think there are more things in this world than we can easily explain. Whether the shadow man was real in the way we understand reality, I cannot say. But I believe my grandfather experienced something genuine, something that stayed with him his entire life. Emily nodded, respecting the woman's measured response. Did he leave behind any writings about these experiences? Journals or letters, perhaps? Not that I know of, Mrs. Miller said. Grandfather was a storyteller, not a writer. But, she hesitated, there is one thing. After he died, my mother found a small box hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards in his study. Inside was the pocket watch he received on his 8th birthday, and a collection of strange objects he'd gathered over the years. Things he claimed were gifts from the shadow man. Emily's interest was immediately piqued. Do you know what happened to that box and its contents? My mother kept it, Mrs. Miller replied. After she passed, it came to me. I still have it, in fact. It's at my apartment in the retirement community. Would it be possible for us to see these items? Emily asked, trying not to sound too eager. They might provide valuable historical context for the photograph and the Miller family history. Mrs. Miller studied Emily's face for a moment, as if assessing her intentions. Then she nodded slowly. I suppose there's no harm in it. These stories and objects are part of our family history, but they're also part of Oakwood's past. If they can contribute to your understanding, I'm willing to share them. She turned to Marcus's grandmother, who had been sitting quietly throughout the conversation. Martha, would you be a dear and take me home so I can retrieve the box? I think these young historians should see what Tom Miller left behind. While Marcus and his grandmother took Mrs. Miller back to the retirement community, Emily remained at the Historical Society, her mind racing with the implications of what they'd learned. The Shadow Man story provided a tantalizing possible explanation for the anomalous shadow in the photograph, but it raised as many questions as it answered. If Thomas Miller had indeed created an elaborate fantasy about a shadow being who visited him throughout his life, could that somehow have manifested in the photograph taken on his 8th birthday? Or was the photographic anomaly merely a coincidence that later inspired his stories? Or, and this was the possibility that both intrigued and unsettled Emily, was there something more to it? Could the camera have captured something that existed beyond ordinary perception? She found herself looking at her own shadow, cast on the floor by the overhead lights. It mimicked her movements precisely, as shadows should. The idea that it might suddenly move independently, take form, and communicate with her was both fascinating and disturbing. Emily returned to the digitized version of the photograph on her computer, zooming in once more on the mismatched shadow. Now, knowing the story of the Shadow Man, she could almost imagine the silhouette taking shape, those gleaming eyes that Mrs. Miller had described emerging from the featureless darkness. She was still staring at the screen when her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Marcus. "We're on our way back," he informed her. Mrs. Miller found the box right where she remembered it. "She's bringing it with her." "That's great," Emily replied, feeling a flutter of anticipation. "How does she seem? Not too tired from all this activity, I hope." Marcus chuckled. "Are you kidding? She's energized. Says she hasn't had this much excitement in years. My grandmother's the one who's looking worn out." When they returned, Mrs. Miller was indeed looking remarkably sprightly for a woman of her age. In her hands, she carried a wooden box about the size of a small jewelry case, its surface darkened with age and polished by years of handling. "Here we are," she announced, placing the box on the table. "Tom Miller's treasures, untouched since my mother gave them to me 30 years ago." The box was simple but beautifully crafted, with no lock but a small brass latch that had developed a rich patina. Mrs. Miller opened it carefully, revealing a velvet-lined interior containing several objects. The first item she removed was the pocket watch, a handsome silver timepiece with an intricate engraving of oak leaves around its circumference. "This was the birthday gift," she explained, holding it up so they could see it catch the light. "The one he received the day the Shadow Man first appeared to him." Emily examined it respectfully. The watch was well made but not especially valuable. A respectable gift for a boy in 1910, but not extravagant. "Does it still work?" "No," Mrs. Miller replied. "It stopped at the exact moment of my grandfather's death, or so my mother claimed. I've never tried to wind it." She set the watch aside and reached into the box again, this time withdrawing a small cloth pouch. From it, she tipped a collection of unusual pebbles and stones into her palm. Grandfather claimed these were stones from the shadow world. They look ordinary enough, but he insisted they had special properties. The stones did indeed appear unremarkable. Smooth river pebbles in various dark colors, a piece of what might be obsidian, a small chunk of coal. Nothing that couldn't be found in any New England streambed or forest floor. Next came a small glass vial containing what appeared to be fine black sand. "Shadow dust," Mrs. Miller explained, "supposedly collected from the footprints left by the Shadow Man." There were several more items. A feather so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a small key made of a dark metal that none of them could identify, and a piece of paper folded into a complex origami shape that Mrs. Miller said her grandfather had been taught by the Shadow Man. The final item in the box was a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "I thought you said your grandfather didn't keep a written record," Emily said, eyeing the journal with interest. "This isn't his writing," Mrs. Miller clarified. "According to family lore, this belonged to the original Shadow Man, a being who lived centuries ago and discovered how to transform himself into a shadow entity. My grandfather said it was given to him during their final meeting, just before he died." She handed the journal to Emily. "I've never been able to make sense of it. The writing isn't in any language I recognize." Emily accepted the journal carefully, mindful of its fragile condition. Opening it to a random page, she found it filled with strange symbols and diagrams. Not any alphabet she was familiar with, but a series of pictographs and geometric patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic. "May I?" Marcus asked, holding out his hand. Emily passed him the journal, and he flipped through it with a scholar's careful touch. "This is remarkable. It looks almost like some form of alchemical notation, but not any system I've studied." He looked up at Mrs. Miller. "Would it be possible for us to digitize this? It might help us decipher the content." The elderly woman nodded. "You may. In fact, you can borrow the entire box if it will help your research. I've kept these items safe for decades, but perhaps it's time they yielded their secrets." She smiled faintly. "My grandfather would have approved, I think. He always said the Shadow Man's story wasn't just for our family, but would someday have meaning for others." After Mrs. Miller left, promising to return the following week to hear of any discoveries they might make, Emily and Marcus carefully documented each item from the box, photographing them from multiple angles and creating detailed descriptions. The journal proved the most intriguing item. Under high-resolution scanning, details emerged that weren't immediately apparent to the naked eye. subtle variations in the ink suggesting that it had been written over a long period with different writing implements, and watermarks on some pages that hinted at considerable age. "I'm going to send these images to a colleague in the linguistics department," Marcus said as they finished the scans. "Dr. Reeves specializes in dead languages and obscure writing systems. If anyone can make sense of this, she can." Emily nodded, still turning over the story of the Shadow Man in her mind. "What do you make of all this?" she asked. "The photograph, the stories, these objects? Do you think there's anything to it beyond an elaborate family tale?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure. The logical part of me wants to say it's just a combination of an unusual photographic effect and a creative grandfather who spun it into stories for his grandchildren. But," he glanced at the items spread across the table, "there's something compelling about the consistency of it all, and that shadow in the photograph is genuinely strange." Emily agreed. Despite her natural skepticism, she found herself drawn to the possibility that Thomas Miller had experienced something genuinely unexplainable, something that had followed him throughout his life and been captured just once by a photographer's camera on a spring morning in 1910. That evening, Emily took copies of the journal pages home with her, along with her notes from the day's discoveries. She had intended to review them before bed, but exhaustion overcame her, and she fell asleep on the couch with the papers spread across her coffee table. Her dreams that night were the most vivid yet. She stood in a vast, empty landscape where everything, the ground, the sky, the distant hills, existed in shades of gray and black. The world seemed composed entirely of shadows, yet somehow she could see clearly, as if her eyes had adjusted to perceive distinctions in darkness that would normally be invisible. A figure approached from the distance, tall and thin, exactly as Mrs. Miller had described the Shadow Man. As it drew nearer, Emily could see that it was indeed featureless, save for eyes that somehow caught non-existent light. It raised one arm in greeting, the same posture as the anomalous shadow in Thomas Miller's photograph. In the dream, Emily wasn't afraid. She felt curiosity and a strange sense of recognition, as if she were meeting someone she had known about for a long time. "You've found me," a voice said, though the figure had no visible mouth. The words seemed to form directly in her mind, just as he did all those years ago. "Thomas Miller?" Emily asked. The figure inclined its head in affirmation. "He was special. He could see beyond the veil that separates your world from mine. As can you. What is this place?" Emily asked, looking around at the shadow landscape. "A parallel realm that exists alongside your own," the figure explained. "Where I come from, shadows are not merely the absence of light. They are the fundamental substance of existence." Emily thought of the photograph. "And you can cross between worlds?" "At certain times, in certain places, when the conditions are right," the Shadow Man confirmed. "Your friend was correct about the journal. It contains the knowledge of how this is possible. The key to understanding lies in deciphering those symbols." Before Emily could ask more questions, the dreamscape began to dissolve around her. The Shadow Man's form blurred, but his final words reached her clearly. "Find the others. They're hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered." Emily awoke with a start, the dream still vivid in her mind. Outside, dawn was breaking, the first light of day casting long shadows across her living room. For a disorienting moment, she found herself watching those shadows warily, half expecting them to move independently of the objects casting them. She shook herself mentally. It was just a dream, inspired by the strange photograph and Mrs. Miller's stories. Nothing more. And yet, it had felt significant somehow, as if her subconscious was processing the information they'd gathered and offering her a new perspective. The Shadow Man's parting words echoed in her mind. "Find the others. They're hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered." Others? Other what? Other photographs with anomalous shadows? Other people who had encountered the Shadow Man? The dream hadn't clarified that point. As Emily prepared for work, she found her thoughts returning to the Historical Society's extensive collection of photographs. If one image contained an unexplainable shadow anomaly, could there be others? The digitization project was less than a quarter complete. There could be dozens, even hundreds of photographs they hadn't yet examined closely. When she arrived at the Historical Society, she found Marcus already there, looking excited. "I heard back from Dr. Reeves," he announced before Emily could even set down her bag. "She was fascinated by the journal pages I sent her. Says she's never seen anything quite like it. but some of the symbols bear similarities to ancient Sumerian cuneiform and others to Chinese oracle bone script, writing systems that developed independently and shouldn't have any connection. What does she make of that? Emily asked, hanging up her coat. She thinks it might be some kind of constructed language, something created deliberately rather than evolving naturally, Marcus explained. She's going to work on it when she has time, but she warned it could take months to make any real progress without some kind of key or cipher. Emily nodded, then shared her own thoughts. I've been thinking about what Mrs. Miller said, about her grandfather encountering the shadow man multiple times throughout his life. What if the birthday photograph wasn't the only one where this anomaly appeared? Marcus caught on immediately. You think there might be other photographs in the collection with similar shadow discrepancies? It's worth looking for, Emily replied. We've been focused on digitizing everything systematically, but maybe we should prioritize photographs of the Miller family, especially ones taken at what Mrs. Miller described as pivotal moments: Thomas's wedding, the births of his children, and so on. Good idea, Marcus agreed. I can pull all the Miller family photographs we've cataloged so far and do an initial review. They spent the morning reorganizing their approach to the digitization project, identifying Miller family photographs and other images that might be relevant to their investigation. By lunchtime, they had compiled a list of several dozen photographs to examine more closely. As they worked, Emily found herself thinking about her dream and the strange landscape of shadows. It had felt so real, so vivid, not like an ordinary dream at all. She debated whether to mention it to Marcus, but decided against it for now. Without any tangible connection to their research, it would sound like she was letting her imagination run away with her. After lunch, they began scanning and examining the photographs they'd identified. Most showed nothing unusual: conventional family portraits and snapshots that captured ordinary moments in the lives of the Miller family across several generations. But then, late in the afternoon, Marcus let out a low whistle. Emily, take a look at this one. Emily moved to his workstation where he had just scanned a photograph from what appeared to be the 1920s. It showed Thomas Miller, now a young man in his 20s, standing with his bride outside a church on their wedding day. Both were smiling, he in a dark suit with a carnation in the buttonhole, she in a white dress with a long veil. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss, but Marcus pointed to the ground at Thomas's feet. Look at the shadow. Emily leaned closer, her heart rate quickening. While the bride's shadow fell naturally behind her on the church steps, Thomas's shadow stretched to one side at an angle that didn't match the position of the sun indicated by other shadows in the image. And the outline was wrong. The shadow showed a figure that seemed to have one hand reaching toward the bride, although Thomas's arms were at his sides in the photograph. It's the same anomaly, Emily breathed. Different photograph, different time, but the same impossible shadow. They looked at each other, the implications sinking in. This wasn't an isolated occurrence or a quirk of one particular photograph. Something had followed Thomas Miller through his life, manifesting in photographs taken years apart. Let's keep looking, Emily said, her voice hushed with a mixture of excitement and unease. By the end of the day, they had found 3 more photographs with similar anomalies. One of Thomas holding his firstborn child in 1923, another of him standing outside his hardware store in the 1940s, and a final one taken at his 70th birthday celebration in 1972, just a decade before his death. In each case, the shadow didn't match Thomas's posture or position. Sometimes the discrepancy was subtle: an arm slightly out of alignment, the silhouette's head turned while Thomas faced the camera. In others, it was more dramatic, the shadow appearing to interact with other elements in the photograph that Thomas himself wasn't touching. This can't be coincidence, Marcus said as they gathered the anomalous photographs together. And it can't be a technical issue with the camera or development process. These were taken years apart, presumably by different photographers using different equipment. Emily nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. It's as if something was with him throughout his life, visible only as a distortion in his shadow, but captured permanently by the camera. The shadow man, Marcus murmured, voicing what they were both thinking. They carefully documented their findings, creating high-resolution scans of each anomalous photograph and noting the specific discrepancies. It was meticulous work, and by the time they finished, evening had fallen. The Historical Society building was quiet, most staff having departed hours earlier. I think we should share these discoveries with Professor Harmon, Emily said as they prepared to leave. And with Mrs. Miller, of course. She provided the context that helped us know what to look for. Marcus agreed. I'll set up appointments for tomorrow if possible. The professor was keen to stay involved, and I'm sure Mrs. Miller will be fascinated to see the additional evidence supporting her grandfather's stories. As they switched off lights and locked doors, Emily found herself glancing at their shadows cast by the security lighting, checking, almost unconsciously, that they behaved as shadows should. They did, moving in perfect synchronization with their bodies as they walked to the parking lot. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed, that somewhere in the darkness surrounding the pools of light, something was watching with interest as they uncovered a mystery that had lain dormant for nearly a century. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, she found herself unusually alert to the shadows in her apartment, the way they stretched and shrank as she moved from room to room, the subtle shifts as clouds passed over the moon outside. She had never paid much attention to shadows before, treating them as unremarkable side effects of light. Now she found herself wondering if there might be more to them, if they might, in some circumstances, serve as bridges between worlds, rather than mere absences of illumination. She took out the copies of the journal pages again, studying the strange symbols with renewed interest. If Dr. Reeves was right and this was a constructed language, what was it meant to communicate? Knowledge of how to traverse between the world of light and the world of shadows. Wisdom from a realm humans rarely perceived. As she studied the pages, one symbol began to stand out, a complex arrangement of lines that resembled a star within a circle, with smaller markings arrayed around it. She had seen it repeated on several pages, always in what seemed to be prominent positions in the text. On impulse, Emily took a pencil and began to trace the symbol on a blank sheet of paper. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, recreating the intricate pattern with surprising precision. When she finished, she set down the pencil and studied what she had drawn. The symbol seemed to vibrate slightly on the page, though she told herself it was just an optical illusion caused by fatigue. She had been staring at documents and photographs all day. Her eyes were strained. Emily set aside the papers and turned off the light, settling into bed. Outside her window, a street lamp cast a yellow glow that filtered through her curtains, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on her bedroom wall. As she drifted towards sleep, those patterns seemed to coalesce into the shape she had just drawn, the star within a circle, hanging momentarily on her wall before dissolving back into random shapes as a car passed by outside, its headlights briefly altering the play of light and shadow. Emily's dreams that night were fragmented and strange, filled with shifting shadows and glimpses of a world like the one she had seen the previous night, a place where darkness had substance and form. The Shadow Man appeared again, sometimes distant, sometimes close, always watching. But this time, he was not alone. Other figures moved through the shadow landscape, their forms indistinct but their presence undeniable. "Who are they?" Emily asked in the dream. "Others like me," the Shadow Man replied. "Those who have learned to exist between worlds. Some were born in your realm and found their way to ours. Others began here and reached across the divide." "And Thomas Miller? What was he to you?" "A bridge," came the answer. "A rare individual who could perceive our world without crossing into it. There have been others throughout history, those with the gift of seeing beyond ordinary perception. Some called them prophets, others called them mad. Most learned to hide their ability for fear of being misunderstood." Before Emily could ask more questions, the dream shifted, and she found herself standing in what appeared to be Thomas Miller's bedroom on the day of his 8th birthday. She watched as the young boy admired his new pocket watch, holding it up to the light streaming through his window. Then, just as Mrs. Miller had described, the boy's shadow on the wall began to move independently, stretching and changing until it took the form of a tall, thin figure. Young Thomas turned, his expression a mixture of fear and fascination as he beheld the Shadow Man for the first time. No words were exchanged that Emily could hear, but she understood somehow that communication was taking place, that the Shadow Man was explaining his existence and his purpose in appearing to the child. Thomas nodded, his initial fear fading into curiosity. He stepped forward, reaching out one hand toward the shadow figure. The Shadow Man mirrored the gesture, extending what passed for an arm in his ethereal form. As their hands met, solid flesh against insubstantial darkness, a spark of energy seemed to pass between them. The Shadow Man's form became momentarily more defined, more present, while Thomas himself seemed to flicker slightly, as if becoming partially transparent. The connection lasted only an instant before they separated, both returning to their normal states. But something had changed. A link had been established between them, a bridge between worlds that would persist throughout Thomas Miller's life. Emily woke from the dream with a gasp, her heart racing. Dawn was breaking outside, the room filling with the gray light of early morning. She reached for her phone and found a text message from Marcus, sent just minutes earlier. Dr. Reeves had a breakthrough with the journal, meeting at the Historical Society at 9. She says it's important. Fully alert now, Emily got out of bed and began preparing for the day with an urgency born of anticipation. Whatever Dr. Reeves had discovered might help make sense of the dreams that had been haunting her, dreams that felt increasingly like more than mere products of her subconscious mind. When Emily arrived at the Historical Society at 8:30, she found Marcus and Dr. Reeves already there, heads bent over pages of the journal spread across the workroom table. Dr. Reeves was younger than Emily had expected, perhaps in her mid-40s, with short gray-streaked hair and bright, intelligent eyes behind round glasses. She looked up as Emily entered, offering a brief smile before returning her attention to the journal pages. "Dr. Thornton," she acknowledged, "Marcus has been telling me about your discoveries. Quite extraordinary." "Thank you for coming," Emily replied, setting down her bag and joining them at the table. "Marcus said you've had a breakthrough." "Of sorts," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "It's preliminary, but fascinating nonetheless." She pointed to the symbol Emily had noticed the night before, the star within a circle. "This recurring glyph appears to be a key of some kind. It marks sections of text that follow a more structured pattern than the surrounding content." "Do you know what it means?" Emily asked, remembering how the symbol had seemed to appear in her room the night before, formed by shadow and light on her wall. "Not precisely," Dr. Reeves admitted, "but I believe it relates to what we might call transition points, or thresholds, places where boundaries between states become permeable. The surrounding text contains repeated elements that resemble ancient descriptive terms for liminal spaces: dawn and dusk, shorelines, doorways, crossroads, thresholds between worlds," Marcus suggested, "places where one might cross from the ordinary world to somewhere else." Dr. Reeves nodded. "That would be consistent with the overall structure of the text, which appears to be instructional in nature. It reads like a manual or guide of some kind, though obviously I can only infer this from patterns and context, not from a literal translation." Emily thought of her dream, the moment when Thomas Miller and the Shadow Man had touched, creating a temporary bridge between their realms. Could it be instructions for traveling between worlds, or for communicating across some kind of boundary? Possibly, Dr. Reeves agreed. "There are sections that seem to describe a process or procedure, with distinct steps indicated by numbered symbols." She shuffled through the pages, finding one with a series of diagrams. These could be representing stages of transformation or transition. Emily studied the diagrams with interest. They showed a progression of figures, beginning with what appeared to be an ordinary human silhouette, then showing that figure gradually merging with or becoming its own shadow through several intermediate stages. "There's something else," Dr. Reeves continued, her tone becoming more cautious. "Last night, after working on these pages for several hours, I had the most vivid dream. A dream of a world composed entirely of shadows, where darkness had substance and form." Emily and Marcus exchanged startled glances. "You too?" Emily asked quietly. Dr. Reeves looked up sharply. "You've had similar dreams?" Emily nodded. "Since we discovered the photograph with the anomalous shadow. Dreams of a shadow world, and a figure Mrs. Miller's grandfather called the Shadow Man." A heavy silence fell over the room as the three of them contemplated the implications. It was one thing for Emily to have such dreams after immersing herself in the mystery of Thomas Miller's photographs and his granddaughter's stories. It was quite another for Dr. Reeves, who had only seen the journal pages and knew nothing of the broader context, to independently experience similar visions. "This is getting weird," Marcus finally said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Perhaps," Dr. Reeves replied, her academic composure returning. "Or perhaps it's simply a matter of suggestion. The human mind is highly susceptible to imagery and patterns. Working intensively with these symbols may have influenced my dream content in ways I'm not consciously aware of." Emily wasn't so sure. Her dreams had felt too real, too consistent to be mere products of suggestion, and the timing was too coincidental, beginning precisely when they discovered the anomalous shadow in Thomas Miller's photograph. "There's one way to test whether there's more to this than psychological suggestion," she said slowly, an idea taking shape in her mind. Mrs. Miller mentioned that her grandfather collected objects he claimed came from the shadow world: the stones, the feather, the black sand. If we could have those analyzed scientifically, we might find evidence of whether they're truly unusual in some way. Marcus looked thoughtful. The university has equipment for material analysis: spectrometers, electron microscopes. I could ask Professor Harmon if he could help us get access. I have colleagues in the chemistry and geology departments who might be interested as well, Dr. Reeves offered, particularly if framed as an interdisciplinary investigation of historical artifacts. They made plans to meet again the following day with Professor Harmon and to contact Mrs. Miller about borrowing the objects for analysis. In the meantime, Dr. Reeves would continue working on deciphering the journal, focusing on the sections marked by the star and circle symbol that seemed so significant. As they wrapped up their impromptu meeting, Emily found herself staring at the photographs they had discovered. 5 images spanning Thomas Miller's life, each showing the same impossible shadow anomaly. What had begun as an interesting historical curiosity was becoming something much more complex and potentially profound. If Thomas Miller had indeed encountered a being from another realm, a being that had remained connected to him throughout his life, what did that suggest about the nature of reality? About the limitations of human perception? About the possibility of worlds existing alongside our own, occasionally intersecting in ways most people never noticed? And why was she dreaming of this shadow world now, nearly a century after Thomas Miller's first encounter with it? Was it merely the power of suggestion working on her subconscious, as Dr. Reeves had proposed? Or was something reaching out to her across the same boundary that had been bridged by Thomas Miller all those years ago? That afternoon, Emily and Marcus met with Professor Harmon to update him on their discoveries and to discuss the possibility of analyzing the objects from Mrs. Miller's box. The professor listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly absorbing the information with a thoughtful expression. 5 photographs over a span of 62 years, all showing the same type of anomaly, he mused when they had finished, and all centered on the same individual. That goes well beyond coincidence or technical artifacts. Do you have any theories about what might explain it? Emily asked. Professor Harmon stroked his chin thoughtfully. Throughout history, there have been accounts of people who claimed to perceive aspects of reality that remained invisible to others. Shamans, mystics, visionaries. Modern science typically dismisses such claims as hallucination or delusion, but he gestured to the photographs spread before them. These images suggest there might be something more tangible to such experiences, something that can occasionally be captured by mechanical means like photography. So you think Thomas Miller really did encounter something from another realm? Marcus asked, his tone suggesting he was still trying to reconcile this possibility with his academic training. I think it would be premature to dismiss the possibility, the professor replied carefully, especially given the consistent nature of the anomalies and their correlation with the stories Mrs. Miller shared about her grandfather's experiences. He picked up one of the photographs, the image of Thomas as a young father holding his firstborn child. Notice how the anomalous shadow here seems protective, curved around both Thomas and the infant, almost like a sheltering presence. Emily looked more closely and saw that he was right. While Thomas's actual posture showed him holding the baby conventionally, his shadow on the wall behind him appeared to be cradling the child in a more encompassing, protective gesture. It's as if the shadow man was not just observing but participating in these significant moments, she said quietly. Professor Harmon nodded. Precisely. If, and I stress if, we are dealing with an entity from another realm of existence, it seems to have formed a connection with Thomas Miller that was benevolent in nature. A guardian of sorts, perhaps. He set down the photograph. Regarding the objects Mrs. Miller has preserved, I would indeed be very interested in analyzing them. I have colleagues in several departments who owe me favors and would likely grant us access to their equipment without asking too many questions. What would you be looking for specifically? Marcus asked. Anomalies in composition, structure, or behavior, the professor explained. Materials that don't match known terrestrial substances, unusual atomic or molecular arrangements, properties that defy conventional physical laws. He smiled slightly. Of course, the most likely outcome is that we'll find these are perfectly ordinary objects. Stones, sand, feathers that could be found anywhere. But science progresses by testing hypotheses, not by assuming outcomes. They made arrangements for Professor Harmon to join them the following day, when Mrs. Miller was scheduled to return with the box of objects. Emily was glad to have the professor involved. His combination of scientific rigor and open-mindedness provided a balanced approach to their increasingly strange investigation. As Emily drove home that evening, her mind was full of the day's discoveries and discussions. The convergence of evidence was becoming harder to dismiss. The photographic anomalies, the consistent narrative from Mrs. Miller, Dr. Reeves's independent experience of shadow world dreams after examining the journal, and now Professor Harmon's willingness to consider explanations beyond conventional understanding. She found herself watching shadows with new awareness. The long shapes cast by trees in the setting sun, the shifting darkness beneath cars and buildings, the way her own shadow stretched before her as she walked from her car to her apartment building. Had she ever really looked at shadows before? Had she considered what they might represent beyond the simple blocking of light? In her apartment, Emily made a simple dinner and then spread her notes and copies of the journal pages across her dining table. She was drawn again to the diagrams showing the progression of a human figure merging with its shadow. There was something compelling about them, a sense of potential transformation that stirred both curiosity and unease. On impulse, Emily took out a sheet of paper and began to redraw the diagrams, copying them carefully from the journal pages. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had done this before, perhaps many times. Her hand moved with increasing confidence, reproducing the intricate symbols and figures with precision. When she completed the final diagram, showing the human figure and shadow fully merged into a new form that seemed neither fully solid nor fully ephemeral, Emily sat back and studied what she had created. The sequence told a story of transformation, of boundaries between states becoming permeable and eventually dissolving. "Is this what happened to you?" she murmured, thinking of the shadow man from her dreams. "Were you once human, before you learned to exist in the realm of shadows?" As if in response to her question, the lamp on her desk flickered briefly, causing the shadows in the room to shift. Emily felt a momentary chill, as if a subtle change had occurred in the atmosphere around her. She looked at the shadows cast by the objects on her table, papers, books, a coffee mug, and for an instant thought she saw movement that didn't correspond to any physical movement in the room. Just a quick ripple through the darkness, like a stone dropped into still water. Emily blinked, and the shadows were normal again, motionless except when she moved and caused the light to shift. She told herself it was just her imagination, heightened by the intensity of their investigation and the lack of adequate sleep over the past few days. But as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that in recreating those diagrams, she had taken a step toward something unprecedented. A threshold had been approached, if not yet crossed. She fell asleep thinking of shadows and boundaries, of worlds existing alongside one another, occasionally touching at points of transition. In her dreams, she returned to the shadow realm. But this time it was different. Instead of merely observing, she moved through the landscape with purpose, as if she belonged there. The shadow man walked beside her, no longer a mysterious observer, but a guide. "You're beginning to understand," he said, his voice resonating directly in her mind. "The journal is not just a record. It is a key, a means of transition." "Transition to what?" Emily asked. "To awareness first," the shadow man replied. "Then, for those with the capacity to crossing. The boundaries between realms are not fixed but permeable for those who learn the ways." They reached what appeared to be a gateway of sorts, two towering pillars of deeper darkness against the gray-black landscape, with symbols etched into their surfaces. Emily recognized the star and circle pattern prominently displayed at the apex of the arch between the pillars. "Thomas Miller approached this threshold but never crossed it," the shadow man explained. "He could perceive our world, but remained anchored in his own. That was his choice, and we respected it." "And me?" Emily asked, looking up at the imposing gateway. "What is my choice?" The shadow man turned to her, those gleaming eyes fixing on her with an intensity she could feel. "That remains to be seen. You have taken the first steps by recreating the transition diagrams. The choice to proceed further is yours alone. What lies beyond the gateway?" "Understanding," came the reply. "Knowledge of the spaces between worlds, the shadows that connect all things. Power, for those who seek it. Peace, for those who desire only to observe and learn." Emily looked beyond the gateway but could see only swirling darkness, neither inviting nor forbidding, simply unknown. There is no need to decide now, the shadow man said, seeming to sense her hesitation. Few are ready to cross immediately upon discovering the possibility. Thomas Miller lived his entire life at the threshold, perceiving both worlds but remaining firmly in his own. That, too, is a valid choice. The dream began to fade, the shadow landscape dissolving around her. The last image Emily saw was the gateway with its star and circle symbol, standing as both invitation and warning at the boundary between worlds. She awoke to early morning light filtering through her curtains, the dream still vivid in her mind. Unlike ordinary dreams that tended to fragment upon waking, this one remained clear and coherent, as if it had been an actual experience rather than a product of her sleeping mind. Emily reached for her phone and found a text from Marcus. Mrs. Miller confirmed for 10 a.m. Professor Harmon will meet us at 11 to collect the objects for analysis. As she prepared for the day, Emily debated whether to share her dream experiences with the others. Would they think she was becoming too personally involved in the investigation, perhaps even losing her objectivity? Or would they see her dreams as potentially valuable insights, additional data points in their exploration of the shadow phenomenon? She decided to wait and see how the day unfolded. If an appropriate moment presented itself, she would share what she had experienced. If not, she would continue to observe and document her dreams privately, treating them as a personal dimension of the investigation. When she arrived at the Historical Society, she found Marcus already setting up the workroom for Mrs. Miller's visit, arranging chairs and preparing tea. "I thought we should make this comfortable for her," he explained when Emily raised an eyebrow at the teacups and saucers he had borrowed from the Society's kitchenette. "She's been incredibly generous with her family's history and artifacts. The least we can do is offer some hospitality." Emily smiled, appreciating his thoughtfulness. "You're right. And given what we're going to ask of her today, permission to subject her grandfather's treasured objects to scientific analysis, a bit of tea and comfort is definitely in order." Mrs. Miller arrived precisely at 10, looking as sprightly as ever despite her advanced age. Marcus's grandmother had accompanied her again, the two elderly women having apparently formed a friendship through their involvement in the investigation. "Good morning, my dear." Mrs. Miller greeted Emily warmly. "Marcus tells me you've made some remarkable discoveries since we last spoke." "We have indeed," Emily confirmed, helping the elderly woman to the most comfortable chair. "We've found 4 more photographs in the collection that show the same shadow anomaly as the birthday portrait, spanning your grandfather's entire life." "I knew it," Mrs. Miller said with satisfaction. "Tom always said the shadow man stayed with him throughout his life." "It's quite something to have photographic evidence of that, isn't it?" Emily nodded, struck again by the elderly woman's matter-of-fact acceptance of what most people would consider impossible. "We've also made progress with the journal," she continued, pouring tea for their guest. "Dr. Reeves, our linguistics expert, believes it contains instructions for crossing between worlds, as strange as that sounds." Mrs. Miller nodded, unsurprised. "Grandfather said the shadow man existed in a realm parallel to our own, but could cross over under certain conditions. He claimed there were others who had learned to do the same, humans who had discovered the pathway to the shadow world." This aligned so perfectly with Emily's dream that she felt a chill of recognition. "Mrs. Miller," she said carefully, "did your grandfather ever speak of a gateway or threshold of some kind, perhaps marked with a symbol like a star within a circle?" The elderly woman's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, he did. He described it exactly that way. A gateway marked with a star inside a circle, standing at the boundary between worlds." She studied Emily's face intently. "How could you know that? It wasn't in the journal, was it?" Emily hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I've been having dreams, vivid dreams of a shadow world and the being your grandfather called the Shadow Man. In last night's dream, he showed me such a gateway and told me that your grandfather had approached this threshold but chosen never to cross it." A long silence followed this admission. Marcus looked concerned, while his grandmother appeared fascinated. Mrs. Miller herself seemed to be processing the information, her expression thoughtful. "Grandfather said that sometimes the shadow man would communicate through dreams," she finally said. "That it was easier for him to reach our minds when they were open and unguarded in sleep." She set down her teacup carefully. "If you're dreaming of the gateway, then you've been noticed. The question is, what will you do with that attention?" Before Emily could respond, the workroom door opened and Professor Harmon entered, looking apologetic for his early arrival. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, taking in the tea setup and the serious expressions around the table. I was able to secure the laboratory equipment sooner than expected and thought I should come directly here. Emily made quick introductions, and the conversation shifted to the planned analysis of the objects from Thomas Miller's box. Mrs. Miller readily gave her consent, expressing curiosity about what modern scientific examination might reveal about her grandfather's treasures. "I've kept these safe for decades," she said as she handed over the box to Professor Harmon. "It seems fitting that they might finally yield their secrets, though I suspect some aspects of their nature may lie beyond what your instruments can measure." The professor accepted the box with evident reverence. "I assure you, Mrs. Miller, we'll treat these items with the utmost care. And you may be right. Science has its limitations when confronting the truly unknown, but it's a place to start." After finalizing arrangements for the return of the objects following analysis, and promising to share any findings immediately, Emily and Marcus accompanied Professor Harmon to his car, carefully transporting the box of shadow artifacts. "What do you really expect to find?" Emily asked the professor as they secured the box in his trunk. Professor Harmon considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I expect to find that most of these objects are exactly what they appear to be. Ordinary stones, sand, a feather, perhaps darkened or discolored through natural processes or deliberate treatment." He closed the trunk carefully. "But I've been studying unusual phenomena long enough to leave room for surprise. There have been artifacts throughout history that defied conventional explanation, objects with properties that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of physics." "Like what?" Marcus asked. His scholarly curiosity piqued. "The Baghdad battery, for one, an ancient vessel that appears to have been designed to create an electric current, long before electricity was supposedly understood," the professor explained. "Or the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device of such complexity that it has forced historians to reconsider what was possible in terms of early technology." He smiled slightly. "The history of science is filled with moments when we've had to expand our conception of what's possible. Perhaps these objects will provide another such moment." After the professor departed with the artifacts, Emily and Marcus returned to the Historical Society to continue their work. The day passed quickly as they documented their findings and prepared reports on the anomalous photographs for the Society's records. Late in the afternoon, as they were preparing to close up for the day, Emily's phone rang. It was Professor Harmon, his voice tense with excitement. "Dr. Thornton, I think you and Marcus should come to the university laboratory immediately," he said without preamble. "We've found something unusual in one of the artifacts, something that shouldn't be possible." Emily's pulse quickened. "Which artifact? What have you found?" "The black feather," the professor replied. "Under electron microscope examination, its structure is unlike any known bird species. The barbs and barbules are arranged in patterns that don't occur in nature. And there's more. When subjected to certain light frequencies, it exhibits properties that—" He paused, as if struggling to find words. "You really need to see this for yourselves." Emily glanced at Marcus, who had been listening intently to her side of the conversation. He nodded immediately, already reaching for his jacket. "We're on our way," Emily told the professor, ending the call. The university campus was just a 15-minute drive from the Historical Society. As they hurried through the gathering dusk toward the science building, Emily was acutely aware of their shadows stretching out behind them on the pavement, elongated by the setting sun. For just an instant, she thought she saw her shadow move independently, a slight motion that didn't correspond to her own movements. She froze, staring at it, but it was normal again, mimicking her posture exactly as a shadow should. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noticing her sudden stop. "Yes," Emily replied, forcing a smile. "Just thought I saw something. Let's keep going." They found Professor Harmon in a basement laboratory, bent over a sophisticated-looking microscope with several monitors displaying magnified images of what Emily presumed was the black feather. "Ah, you're here," the professor said, looking up with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Come see what we've found." He guided Emily to the microscope while Marcus looked at the monitor displays. Peering through the eyepiece, Emily saw the feather's structure magnified hundreds of times. At first glance, it appeared similar to other feathers she had seen in biology textbooks, a central shaft with barbs extending outward, and smaller barbules connecting the barbs to form a unified surface. But as she looked more closely, she began to notice the differences. The arrangement wasn't random or naturally evolved, but followed precise geometric patterns. The barbules connected in ways that created recognizable symbols when viewed at certain magnifications, including, she realized with a shock, the star-encircled pattern from the journal and her dreams. "Do you see it?" Professor Harmon asked. "The deliberate patterning? No natural evolutionary process could produce this level of geometric precision." Emily nodded, too stunned to speak immediately. She straightened from the microscope. "It looks almost engineered." "Exactly," the professor agreed. "But that's not all. Look at this." He pressed a button that activated an ultraviolet light source directed at the feather, then adjusted the microscope settings. Emily looked through the eyepiece again and gasped. Under UV illumination, the feather was no longer simply black. It glowed with patterns of light that shifted and moved across its surface, flowing through the structure like liquid electricity. "That's not fluorescence or any known form of bioluminescence," Professor Harmon explained. "We've tested it against every known reference sample. Whatever energy is moving through that feather, it's not operating according to principles we currently understand." Marcus looked up from one of the monitors, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. Could it be some kind of nanotechnology, something artificially created? "If so, it's far beyond our current capabilities," the professor replied. "The structures we're seeing operate at a subcellular level, with a complexity that would require fabrication technologies we won't develop for decades, possibly centuries." He gestured to another monitor displaying chemical analysis results. "And the material composition includes elements and configurations that shouldn't be stable, but somehow are." Emily thought of her dream. The shadow man explaining that the journal was a key to awareness first, then crossing. Was this feather tangible proof of another realm with different physical laws? An artifact that truly originated in the shadow world Thomas Miller had described? "Have you examined the other objects?" she asked. Professor Harmon nodded. "The stones appear to be ordinary river pebbles, though we're still analyzing them for unusual properties. The black sand is more interesting. Under microscopic examination, each grain has the same unusual internal structure, suggesting it's not sand at all but some other particulate material." He pointed to a sealed container on a nearby workbench. "And the key? Well, that's presenting its own mysteries." Emily moved to the workbench and looked at the small dark key through the clear container. "What have you found?" "It's composed of a metal alloy we can't identify," the professor explained. "It contains elements that are common enough: iron, carbon, trace amounts of other metals, but structured in a crystalline arrangement that shouldn't be possible under normal conditions of temperature and pressure." He shook his head in wonderment. "It's as if it was formed under physical laws different from those that govern our world." The implications hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. If these objects truly originated from another realm, the shadow world of Thomas Miller's experience and Emily's dreams, then everything they thought they knew about reality was just the surface of a much deeper, more complex truth. "What do we do with this information?" Marcus finally asked, voicing the question that had been forming in Emily's mind. Professor Harmon removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking every bit his age. "That, my young friends, is the great question facing us. Scientific discovery is never merely about knowing. It's about what we do with that knowledge." He replaced his glasses. "For now, I suggest we continue our analysis, document everything rigorously, and proceed with caution. Whatever we've stumbled upon here, it appears to be something genuinely new to science." Emily thought of the gateway from her dream, standing at the threshold between worlds, marked with the same star and circle symbol they had found in the journal, and now, incredibly, encoded in the structure of the black feather. "There's something else we should consider," she said slowly. "If these objects really do come from another realm, and if the journal really does contain instructions for crossing between worlds, then we need to think carefully about the implications of that knowledge becoming widely known." Professor Harmon nodded gravely. "I've had the same thought. History is filled with examples of discovery outpacing wisdom, of knowledge being acquired before we've developed the ethical framework to use it responsibly." He gestured to the feather under the microscope. "If there truly is a way to cross between our world and whatever other realm might exist, the consequences could be profound for good or ill. So we keep this between us for now?" Marcus asked. "Just the three of us, Dr. Reeves, and Mrs. Miller, and my grandmother, who already knows much of it," Emily added, thinking of the elderly women who had become unexpected participants in their investigation. "I think that's wise," Professor Harmon agreed, "at least until we better understand what we're dealing with. Scientific caution demands nothing less." As they left the laboratory later that evening, having helped the professor secure the artifacts and documentation, Emily found herself looking at the world around her with new eyes. The campus buildings cast long shadows in the light of the street lamps, ordinary shadows that behaved as they should, stretching and shrinking as light sources shifted. But now she wondered what might exist within or beyond those shadows. What threshold might be crossed if one knew the way? The world suddenly seemed both larger and stranger than she had ever imagined, filled with possibilities and mysteries that conventional science was only beginning to approach. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, she took out the diagrams she had drawn, the sequence showing a human figure gradually merging with its shadow. In light of what they had discovered in the laboratory, these no longer seemed like merely symbolic representations but potentially literal instructions for some kind of transformation. She placed the diagrams on her bedside table, wondering if the Shadow Man would visit her dreams again tonight, and what new revelations might await her if he did. Part of her was afraid of what it might mean to peer too deeply into mysteries that had remained hidden for most of human history. But a stronger part was drawn forward by curiosity and wonder, by the scientist's innate desire to understand. As she drifted towards sleep, she found herself thinking of Thomas Miller, the little boy who had smiled proudly for a photograph in 1910, unaware that the camera would capture not just his image but evidence of a being from another realm who would remain connected to him throughout his life. Had that connection been a burden or a gift? Had the Shadow Man's presence enriched Thomas Miller's life or complicated it? And what might it mean for Emily herself, now that she had been noticed by whatever intelligence existed in that parallel world of shadows? These questions followed her into sleep, where once again the shadow realm awaited, a world of darkness and light intertwined, where boundaries blurred and new understandings beckoned from beyond the threshold. In her dream, Emily stood before the gateway again, its star and circle symbol gleaming against the darkness. The Shadow Man was beside her, a presence both familiar and utterly alien. "You've seen the evidence now," he said, his thoughts flowing directly into her mind. "The feather, the key, the sand. Fragments of my world that can exist in yours, though they retain properties that your science struggles to explain. Are there others who know about your realm?" Emily asked. "Other humans who have discovered the threshold? Throughout history, there have been those who glimpsed the truth," the Shadow Man replied. "Some by accident, others through dedicated seeking. A few have crossed over temporarily. Fewer still have learned to exist in both realms, as I do. And Thomas Miller? What was special about him? He had the sight from birth, the ability to perceive beyond ordinary limitations. We recognized this quality and made contact when he was young, when his mind was still open to possibilities that adults often reject. The gateway before them began to shimmer, the darkness beyond it swirling with hints of form and movement, suggestions of a vast landscape populated by beings similar to the Shadow Man. Your world is defined by light, the shadow being continued, ours by darkness. But neither is complete without the other. They are complementary aspects of a greater whole, separated long ago but always connected through the thresholds that exist in between. Emily took a step toward the gateway, drawn by curiosity and a strange sense of recognition, as if something beyond it called to a part of herself she had never fully acknowledged. "Not yet," the Shadow Man said, his form shifting to block her path. "You are not prepared for crossing. The journal contains the necessary preparation, mental disciplines that must be mastered before physical transition is attempted. Without them, your consciousness would be overwhelmed." Emily stopped, recognizing the wisdom in his warning. "Is that what the diagrams represent? The preparation process?" "Yes. A gradual alignment of your physical form with its shadow aspect, allowing for eventual transition between states of being." The gleaming eyes studied her. "Few in your time have the patience for such gradual work. You live in an age of immediacy, of instant gratification. The path of shadows requires something different, careful progression, stage by stage." The gateway began to fade, the dream world growing less distinct around her. Emily sensed she was waking up. "There is no hurry." The Shadow Man's voice followed her as consciousness returned. "The threshold has existed for millennia. It will remain, waiting for those prepared to cross." Emily awoke to early morning light, the dream still vivid in her mind. On her bedside table lay the transition diagrams she had drawn, their meaning now clearer than before, not merely symbolic representations, but actual instructions for a process of preparation and transformation. She reached for her phone and found a message from Professor Harmon sent late the previous night. Additional analysis confirms our initial findings. Meeting with Dr. Reeves tomorrow to discuss journal translation in light of these discoveries. 9 a.m., my office. The investigation was accelerating now, pieces falling into place as they correlated the physical evidence with the journal's content and the stories passed down through the Miller family. Emily felt both excitement and trepidation. The thrill of discovery balanced against awareness of the profound implications of what they were uncovering. As she prepared for the day, a question kept returning to her mind. What was their responsibility toward this knowledge? If the journal truly contained instructions for crossing between worlds, who should have access to that information? What might be the consequences if such knowledge became widely available in a world already struggling with technological advances that outpaced ethical considerations? These weren't just academic questions now, but practical concerns that demanded thoughtful consideration. Whatever decisions they made in the coming days might have implications far beyond their small group of researchers, perhaps even beyond their own world, if the Shadow Man's revelations were to be believed. When Emily arrived at Professor Harmon's office the following morning, she found Dr. Reeves already there, surrounded by printouts of journal pages annotated with her translation notes. Marcus arrived shortly after, bringing coffee for everyone, a small gesture of normalcy in what had become an increasingly extraordinary investigation. "I've made significant progress with the journal," Dr. Reeves announced once they were all settled. After seeing the microscopic structure of the feather, with the star and circle symbol embedded in its pattern, I was able to use that as a key to unlock portions of the text that had previously resisted translation. She spread several pages on the professor's desk. "The journal appears to be what we initially suspected, a manual for transitioning between our world and what it calls the Shadow Realm. It describes this realm as existing alongside ours, occupying the same space but in a different dimension isn't quite the right word. A different state of being, like quantum states," Marcus suggested. "Similar in concept," Dr. Reeves agreed. "The text describes reality as having multiple phases, or frequencies, with most beings only able to perceive and interact with the phase they originated in. But it claims there are methods to shift one's consciousness and eventually one's physical form between these phases." "The transition diagrams," Emily said, thinking of her dreams and the sequence she had copied from the journal. Dr. Reeves nodded. "Exactly. They represent stages in a process of attunement and transformation, beginning with simple awareness of the other realm and progressing through various levels of interaction." She pointed to annotations she had made beside one of the diagrams. "This stage involves learning to perceive one's own shadow as something more than the mere absence of light, recognizing it as a connection to the shadow realm." "And these sections here?" Professor Harmon asked, indicating dense passages of text surrounding the third diagram in the sequence. "Mental exercises," Dr. Reeves explained. "Meditation techniques focused on merging one's consciousness with one's shadow." The text is quite specific about the dangers of proceeding too quickly. Apparently, the shadow realm operates according to principles so different from our own that uncontrolled exposure can be psychologically damaging. Emily thought of the Shadow Man's warning in her dream, "You are not prepared for crossing." The correlation between Dr. Reeves's translations and her dream experiences was becoming too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. "There's another element I've managed to decode," Dr. Reeves continued, pulling out a page with complex diagrams resembling maps or charts. "These appear to indicate locations where the boundary between realms is naturally thinner, places where transition is easier to accomplish." She pointed to symbols on the chart. Rivers, caves, ancient crossroads, stone circles, places traditionally associated with liminality in various cultures. The text suggests that these locations have been recognized as special since prehistoric times, precisely because humans could instinctively sense the proximity of the shadow realm there. "That aligns with folklore worldwide," Professor Harmon observed. "Countless traditions speak of thin places where the veil between worlds can be pierced more easily. We've always treated these as metaphorical or superstitious beliefs, but perhaps they reflect genuine perception of these boundary areas." They spent the morning reviewing Dr. Reeves's translations and correlating them with the physical properties of the artifacts they had analyzed. The convergence of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The journal described a shadow realm with different physical laws, and the artifacts displayed properties that couldn't be explained by the physics of our world. "I think we need to consider a practical question," Emily said as their discussion reached a natural pause. "What do we do with this knowledge? If the journal really does contain instructions for crossing between worlds, who should have access to that information?" A thoughtful silence followed. "From a purely scientific perspective, this represents a potential paradigm shift in our understanding of reality," Professor Harmon said slowly. "It would be comparable to the discoveries that led to quantum physics or relativity, revelations that fundamentally altered how we conceive of the universe. But those discoveries, profound as they were, didn't provide instructions for potentially dangerous practices," Dr. Reeves countered. "This is more akin to the development of nuclear physics, knowledge that could lead to both beneficial applications and serious harm, depending on how it's used." Marcus leaned forward, his expression troubled. "There's also the question of impact on the shadow realm itself. If humans began crossing over in significant numbers, what might that mean for whatever civilization or ecosystem exists there? We could be opening the door to a form of interdimensional colonization, with all the ethical problems that implies." Emily nodded, appreciating that they were all taking the implications seriously. "We also need to consider Mrs. Miller's perspective. These artifacts and the journal belong to her family. Thomas Miller chose to keep his experiences largely private, sharing them only as stories for his grandchildren. Perhaps we should respect that approach. A thoughtful restriction of access, rather than complete suppression of the information," Professor Harmon suggested. "Documentation preserved in secure archives, available to qualified researchers under appropriate oversight, but not published openly. At least until we better understand the full implications," Dr. Reeves agreed. They continued discussing the ethical dimensions of their discovery, eventually reaching a tentative consensus. They would complete their research, documenting everything thoroughly, but keeping their findings confidential among their small group. The artifacts would be returned to Mrs. Miller, who would retain ultimate authority over their fate. The journal would be translated completely, but the translation would be secured in the university's restricted archives, accessible only with special permission. As they prepared to conclude their meeting, Emily felt a sense of both satisfaction and lingering uncertainty. They were approaching this extraordinary discovery with appropriate caution, but questions remained that no amount of careful planning could fully address. What might it mean for humanity to confirm the existence of parallel realms? How might such knowledge transform our understanding of consciousness, of reality itself? And on a more personal level, what did it mean that she continued to dream of the shadow realm, to communicate with the being who had first appeared to Thomas Miller nearly a century ago? Was she merely an investigator of this phenomenon, or was she becoming a participant in it? That evening, as Emily drove home through the gathering dusk, the world around her seemed charged with new significance. Shadows lengthened across the landscape, stretching from trees and buildings in the setting sun. She found herself studying them, wondering what they might reveal to eyes trained to truly see. At home, she took out the transition diagrams again, studying them with the benefit of Dr. Reeves's partial translations. The first stage, recognizing one's shadow as more than the absence of light, seemed simple enough. But what did that mean in practice? How did one begin to perceive shadows differently? Emily moved to a wall where the lamp cast her silhouette clearly. She raised one hand, watching as the shadow mimicked her movement perfectly. Then, recalling the meditation techniques Dr. Reeves had mentioned, she focused her attention fully on the shadow, trying to perceive it not as a mere effect of her body blocking light, but as a connection to another state of being. At first, nothing happened. The shadow remained just that, a dark outline moving as she moved. But as she maintained her focus, allowing her consciousness to settle into a state of quiet observation, she began to notice subtle details she had overlooked before. The edges of the shadow weren't perfectly sharp, but graduated in a way that created a faint boundary zone. Within the silhouette itself, there were variations in darkness, not uniform black, but a spectrum of depths. And something else, a quality she struggled to define, a sense of presence or energy that seemed to hum at the threshold of perception. Was she actually sensing something real, or merely projecting her expectations onto an ordinary physical phenomenon? Emily couldn't be sure, but she remembered Thomas Miller's story, how it had begun with simple observation of his shadow behaving strangely, before progressing to full awareness of the shadow man's presence. She continued the exercise for several minutes, then stopped, feeling both foolish and intrigued. If the journal's instructions were genuine, this was only the very beginning of a lengthy process, the first tentative step toward expanded perception. That night, Emily's dreams returned her to the shadow realm, but something had changed. The landscape seemed sharper, more defined, as if her earlier meditation had enhanced her ability to perceive details of this strange environment. Colors that had previously been absent now appeared in subtle ways, not the bright hues of the waking world, but muted tones that somehow existed within the spectrum of darkness. The shadow man appeared, regarding her with what seemed like approval. "You have begun the practice," he observed, "the first recognition of the connection. Is this real?" Emily asked directly. "These dreams, this communication, am I actually connecting with another realm of existence, or is this all happening within my own mind?" "A human question," the shadow man replied, with what might have been amusement. "Your species always seeks to categorize experiences as either objective reality or subjective imagination, when the truth often lies in the spaces between." He gestured to the landscape around them. "This interaction exists in a borderland, neither fully in your world nor fully in mine, but in the threshold space where consciousness can bridge separate states of being." It wasn't quite the definitive answer Emily had hoped for, but it resonated with her scientific training. The most profound discoveries often revealed that traditional categories were insufficient, that nature was more complex and interconnected than simple divisions could capture. "Thomas Miller's photographs," she said, pursuing another question that had been troubling her. "How was it possible for you to appear in them when the camera couldn't possibly have been designed to capture beings from the shadow realm?" "Cameras capture light and its absence," the shadow man explained. "They record shadows as effectively as they record illuminated objects. When I aligned my presence with Thomas Miller's shadow, the camera recorded the result, a shadow that didn't match its caster because it was influenced by my form." Emily considered this. It made a certain kind of sense, though it stretched the boundaries of conventional physics. "And the artifacts? The feather? The key? The sand? How can objects from your realm exist in ours when they operate according to different physical laws?" "They adapt," came the reply. "Just as beings can learn to traverse the threshold, certain objects can exist in both states, though they retain aspects of their original nature. That is why your instruments detect properties that seem impossible according to your understanding of physics." The landscape around them shifted, and suddenly they were standing in what appeared to be a vast library or archive, with shelves stretching in all directions, filled not with books, but with crystalline objects that emitted soft light. "Your kind has barely begun to understand the true nature of reality," the shadow man continued. "You perceive 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, but there are others, states of existence that interpenetrate your world constantly, though most humans remain unaware of them." Emily looked around in wonder at the crystal archive. "What is this place?" "A repository of knowledge accumulated over millennia by those who have learned to traverse the threshold between realms," the shadow man explained. "Some of your ancestors knew of these things, ancient civilizations that developed different ways of perceiving and interacting with reality before such knowledge was lost or suppressed." He guided her to a crystalline structure that appeared to be a map or model of interconnected realms, not just the shadow world and the human world, but multiple states of existence layered and intertwined in complex patterns. "The journal you found is one small fragment of this knowledge," the shadow man said. "Created by a human who learned to cross the threshold centuries ago and wished to leave a path for others to follow. Thomas Miller encountered him in his journeys along the borderland, but chose to remain an observer rather than becoming a traveler between worlds." Emily studied the crystal map, trying to comprehend the cosmology it represented. "Why are you showing me this? Why me, specifically?" The shadow man's form shifted slightly, becoming more defined. "Because, like Thomas Miller, you have the capacity to perceive beyond ordinary limitations. Because you approach the mystery with both skepticism and openness, the balance needed to explore such knowledge responsibly." A pause. "And because transitions are coming, whether humans are prepared or not. The boundaries between realms have always fluctuated through cosmic cycles, and a time of thinning approaches." Sir, this last statement sent a chill through Emily. "What do you mean by a time of thinning?" "Throughout history, there have been periods when the thresholds between worlds become more permeable," the shadow man explained. "Times when crossing occurs more frequently, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Your myths speak of these eras as times of magic, wonder, and occasionally terror. when beings and forces from beyond ordinary perception entered your world in ways that could not be ignored or rationalized away. And such a time is coming again? Emily asked, unsettled by the implications. It has already begun, came the reply. Subtle at first, but accelerating. Those who understand the nature of the thresholds will be needed to guide others, to prevent fear and misunderstanding from leading to harm. The crystal archive began to fade around them, the dream shifting back toward wakefulness. But before it dissolved completely, the Shadow Man left her with a final thought. The photographs of Thomas Miller were not anomalies or accidents. They were messages, evidence left for future generations to find when the time of thinning returned. Evidence that you found precisely when it was needed. Emily woke with the dawn, her mind racing with the revelations of the dream. If what the Shadow Man had told her was true, if boundaries between realms were indeed becoming more permeable, then their small academic investigation had suddenly taken on far greater significance. Was this why the photographs had seemed to call to her from the moment she discovered the first anomalous shadow? Why the journal had appeared precisely when they needed guidance to understand what they were seeing? The coincidences that had led her down this path suddenly seemed less random, more purposeful. She reached for her phone, intending to call Professor Harmon to share these new insights, then hesitated. How much of her dream experience should she reveal? Would the others believe that she was receiving direct communication from a being in the shadow realm, or would they assume she was allowing imagination to color her interpretation of the evidence? In the end, she decided to be selective, to share the concepts and information without necessarily revealing their source. She would present them as theoretical interpretations based on their accumulated evidence, allowing the others to evaluate the ideas on their merits rather than questioning their origin. When she arrived at the Historical Society later that morning, she found Marcus already there, examining new photographs they had identified as potentially containing shadow anomalies. "Any luck?" she asked, setting down her bag. He looked up, his expression animated. "Actually, yes. I think I've found two more, both from the 1950s, showing people who aren't part of the Miller family at all." He gestured for her to join him at the computer. "Look at this one." The photograph showed a group of men standing outside Oakwood's town hall, apparently at some civic ceremony. Marcus zoomed in on one figure, a middle-aged man at the edge of the group whose shadow on the wall behind him didn't quite match his posture. "And this one," he continued, pulling up another image. This showed a woman in a garden, but her shadow among the flowers appeared to have an additional form partially merged with it, a suggestion of another presence sharing the same space. Emily studied the images with growing excitement. So it wasn't just Thomas Miller. Others in Oakwood have experienced these shadow anomalies. "Exactly," Marcus confirmed, which makes me wonder, was there something special about this location? Something that made the boundary between worlds particularly thin here? Emily thought of the crystal map from her dream and the Shadow Man's explanation of fluctuating thresholds. That's possible. Many traditions speak of places where boundaries between worlds are naturally thinner. Sacred sites, power spots, confluences of energy. She pulled out a local map she had brought with her. "Let's mark the locations where all these photographs were taken, if we can identify them. Maybe there's a pattern." They spent the morning creating a detailed map of shadow anomaly locations, using the backgrounds of the photographs and Historical Society records to identify where each image had been captured. By lunchtime, a pattern was indeed emerging. The anomalies clustered along what appeared to be a curved line running through Oakwood, from the old cemetery in the north, through the town center, and ending at a bend in the river to the south. "It almost looks like a ley line," Marcus observed, referring to the theoretical alignments of ancient sites that some believed channeled earth energies, or some kind of natural fault in the, what would we call it, the fabric of reality. "The journal mentioned locations where transition is easier," Emily reminded him. "Places where the boundary is naturally thinner. Maybe Oakwood sits on such a location." They were still discussing the implications when Professor Harmon called to inform them that the analysis of the artifacts was complete and had confirmed their unusual properties. He had also spoken with Dr. Reeves, who had made further progress with the journal translation. "We should meet to discuss next steps," the professor suggested. "Perhaps tomorrow morning? I'd like to invite Mrs. Miller as well, since this concerns her family's legacy." Emily agreed, then shared their discovery of additional shadow anomalies in photographs unrelated to the Miller family. "It seems this phenomenon extends beyond Thomas Miller," she explained, "and there's a geographical pattern to where the anomalies appear. Fascinating, the professor replied, his academic curiosity evident even over the phone. Bring your mapping data tomorrow. We may be on the verge of establishing a new field of study, something at the intersection of physics, geography, and what has traditionally been relegated to paranormal research. After the call ended, Emily and Marcus continued their work, identifying several more photographs with subtle shadow anomalies and adding them to their map. The pattern held. All fell along the same curved line through Oakwood. I wonder if there are other locations like this, Marcus mused as they prepared to leave for the day. Other towns or cities where the boundary is thin. If there are, they might have their own versions of Thomas Miller, Emily suggested. People who noticed the shadow beings and either kept their experiences private or were dismissed as eccentric or imagining things. The possibility was both exciting and sobering. If what they were discovering in Oakwood was not unique but part of a broader phenomenon, it suggested that interactions between realms might have been occurring throughout human history, largely unrecognized or misinterpreted. As Emily drove home that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape. She found herself studying them with new awareness, wondering if others contained anomalies that most people simply never noticed. How many shadow beings might be moving through the world at any given moment, visible only to those with the perception to see them? The following morning brought clear skies and a sense of anticipation as Emily prepared for their meeting. She gathered her notes and the map they had created, carefully marking each location where shadow anomalies had been documented. The pattern was unmistakable now, a curved line running through Oakwood that might represent a natural thin point in the boundary between worlds. When she arrived at Professor Harmon's university office, she found everyone already assembled. Marcus and Dr. Reeves engaged in quiet conversation. Mrs. Miller seated comfortably in an armchair by the window, looking remarkably alert and interested for a woman of her age. "Ah, Dr. Thornton," the professor greeted her. "We're all here now. Shall we begin?" For the next hour they shared their findings systematically, the analysis of the artifacts confirming their anomalous properties, Dr. Reeves's progress with translating the journal, and Emily and Marcus's discovery of the pattern of shadow anomalies throughout Oakwood. "So, it wasn't just my grandfather," Mrs. Miller said thoughtfully when they had finished. "Others in Oakwood have seen the Shadow Man too, or beings like him." "It appears so," Emily confirmed, though perhaps not all of them recognized what they were experiencing. "Your grandfather seems to have been unusual in his clear awareness of the shadow realm. He always said he had the sight," Mrs. Miller recalled, "that he could see things others couldn't. My mother used to worry it was some kind of mental disturbance, but grandfather was so matter-of-fact about it, so grounded in every other way, that eventually she came to accept it as just part of who he was." Professor Harmon spread out the map on his desk, studying the pattern of anomaly locations. "This curved line through Oakwood, it reminds me of something I encountered years ago during research into sacred geography. Many ancient cultures built their important sites along similar curves or straight lines, often following natural features like ridgelines or waterways. Ley lines," Marcus suggested again. "Yes, though I prefer less loaded terminology," the professor replied with a smile. "Natural energy pathways, perhaps. Whatever we call them, these alignments appear across cultures worldwide, suggesting they may correspond to genuine geophysical or perhaps even dimensional features." Dr. Reeves pointed to sections of her journal translation. "The text describes these pathways explicitly, calling them seams, where realms naturally touch more closely. It says they shift gradually over centuries but remain stable enough that knowledge of their locations was preserved and passed down through generations of those who could perceive them. And Oakwood sits on one such seam," Emily said, the pieces falling into place. "Not just anywhere on it," Marcus added, indicating the point where the town's main street crossed the river. "The original settlement was built precisely at a critical point on the pathway, where it crosses the water. Water boundaries are mentioned repeatedly in folklore as liminal spaces." Mrs. Miller nodded slowly. "My grandfather once said that Oakwood wasn't chosen as a settlement location by accident. He claimed the town's founders included people who knew about the shadow realm and deliberately built here to maintain, what did he call it? A watching place, a guardian post." This new information shifted their understanding dramatically. What had begun as an investigation into a single photographic anomaly was expanding into something with historical, geographical, and potentially cosmic significance. "I think we need to visit these locations," Emily suggested, indicating the points on the map where shadow anomalies had been documented. Perhaps there are features or markers we're missing, something physical that indicates awareness of the seam by those who built the town. A field investigation, Professor Harmon agreed. Excellent idea. We should document everything thoroughly. Photographs, measurements, environmental readings if possible. They spent the remainder of the morning planning their field research, deciding to begin that afternoon at the oldest section of town near the cemetery, where several of the anomalous photographs had been taken. As they prepared to leave for lunch before reconvening for the fieldwork, Mrs. Miller approached Emily privately. "You've been having the dreams, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "Communications from the shadow realm." Emily hesitated, then nodded, seeing no point in denying it to this perceptive woman. "Yes. How did you know?" "The way you speak about these things, not just with academic interest, but with a certain recognition." The elderly woman smiled gently. "My grandfather had the same quality in his voice when he told his shadow stories. He wasn't just recounting tales, he was describing experiences." "I wasn't sure how the others would react if I told them," Emily admitted. "They might surprise you," Mrs. Miller suggested. "But either way, you should know you're not alone in this experience. My grandfather walked this path before you, and I suspect others have as well, throughout history." The afternoon found them at the old cemetery on the northern edge of Oakwood, a peaceful enclosure surrounded by ancient oak trees. Emily had brought sophisticated camera equipment capable of capturing high-resolution images, while Professor Harmon carried various scientific instruments, a magnetometer, devices for measuring electromagnetic fields, and other less familiar tools. "What exactly are we looking for?" Marcus asked as they passed through the wrought iron gates. "Anything unusual or out of place?" Emily replied. "Symbols that might correspond to those in the journal, unusual shadow patterns, areas where the atmosphere feels different. Trust your instincts," Professor Harmon advised. "People often perceive subtle environmental changes subconsciously before they can articulate what they're experiencing." They moved methodically through the cemetery, documenting gravestones, architectural features, and the layout of paths and trees. Mrs. Miller, moving more slowly with her cane but insistent on participating, pointed out the Miller family plot where Thomas was buried. "Look at this," she said, indicating the headstone. It was a simple granite marker, but carved into its base, almost hidden by the surrounding grass, was a small star-and-circle symbol, the same pattern they had seen in the journal and embedded in the structure of the black feather. "He knew," Emily breathed, kneeling to examine the symbol more closely. "He had this added to mark his connection to the shadow realm." Professor Harmon's instruments detected nothing unusual around the grave, but as they continued their survey of the cemetery, they found 6 more headstones with the same symbol discreetly incorporated into their design, all positioned along the line they had identified on their map. "These people all knew," Marcus said, photographing each marked grave. "They were aware of the shadow realm and their connection to it. A secret society of sorts," Dr. Reeves suggested. "Or perhaps just individuals who shared an unusual perception and recognized each other." As the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows among the graves, Emily noticed something peculiar. The shadows of certain headstones, specifically those marked with the star and circle symbol, appeared to extend slightly further than they should, based on the angle of the sun and the height of the stones. "Professor," she called, pointing out the discrepancy. "Do you see that?" Professor Harmon observed carefully, then set up a tripod with a measuring device. "You're right. These shadows are approximately 12% longer than they should be according to standard light physics." He looked up, his expression a mixture of scientific excitement and awe. "We're actually measuring a physical manifestation of the boundary distortion." They documented this phenomenon thoroughly before moving to their next location, an old bridge crossing the river at the center of town. Here too they found the star and circle symbol subtly incorporated into the stonework at both ends of the bridge, and shadows that behaved slightly differently than they should. By the time they reached the third location, the town's original meeting house, now a historical museum, the sun was setting, creating dramatic shadows across the landscape. As they approached the building, Emily felt a strange sensation, as if the air had become somehow thicker or more resistant. The others seemed to feel it too, their pace slowing as they neared the structure. "The boundary is particularly thin here," Professor Harmon murmured, his instruments displaying readings he had never seen before. Whatever separates our world from the shadow realm is barely present at this location. Inside the meeting house, they found more evidence of awareness of the shadow realm. Subtle architectural features that created unusual shadow patterns at certain times of day, and hidden symbols worked into the woodwork and stone foundation. As twilight deepened into dusk, the building's interior grew gradually darker, shadows pooling in corners and stretching across floors. Emily found herself drawn to the main hall, where the setting sun cast one final beam of light through a western window, creating a pattern of illumination and shadow on the far wall. Within that pattern, something moved. At first, Emily thought it was just the natural shifting of light as clouds passed overhead or tree branches moved in the evening breeze. But then the movement became more purposeful, more defined. The shadow separated from its surroundings, taking on a familiar form, tall and thin, with gleaming eyes that somehow caught the fading light. "Do you see that?" she whispered to the others, who had joined her in the hall. To her surprise, they all nodded, even Marcus, who had been the most skeptical among them. "The Shadow Man," Mrs. Miller said softly, recognition in her voice, just as my grandfather described him. For a long moment, they all stood transfixed as the shadow figure regarded them from the wall. Then it raised one arm, the same gesture seen in Thomas Miller's birthday photograph 97 years earlier. "It's acknowledging us," Dr. Reeves murmured. Making contact, the figure seemed to be indicating something, pointing toward a section of the wall that appeared ordinary at first glance. Professor Harmon approached cautiously, examining the area with both his instruments and his eyes. "There's something here," he announced, his fingers tracing patterns in the old plaster that weren't immediately visible, text or symbols beneath the surface. As if in response, the shadow figure moved its hand in a sequence of gestures. Dr. Reeves watched intently, her expertise in symbolic languages allowing her to interpret what others might miss. "It's showing us how to reveal what's hidden," she said, excitement building in her voice. A sequence of pressure points in the wall, like a combination lock. Following the shadow's guidance, she pressed her fingers against specific points on the wall in the indicated pattern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft grating sound, a section of the wall moved inward and slid aside, revealing a small chamber that had remained hidden for generations. Inside was a leather-bound book much larger than the journal they had been studying. A comprehensive volume written in the same symbolic language but with detailed illustrations and diagrams. Beside it lay a collection of artifacts similar to those Thomas Miller had gathered, shadow objects that had crossed the threshold between worlds. "A complete record," Dr. Reeves breathed, carefully lifting the book from its resting place. Not just fragments or personal notes, but a full documentation of the shadow realm and how to interact with it. The shadow figure on the wall seemed to pulse with approval or satisfaction. Then, as the last of the daylight faded from the window, it gradually dissolved back into ordinary darkness, leaving them alone with their discovery. That night, as Emily prepared for sleep in her apartment, her mind was still reeling from the events at the meeting house. They had documented everything meticulously before carefully removing the book and artifacts to Professor Harmon's laboratory for safekeeping and study. Tomorrow they would begin the process of translating this new, more comprehensive text, potentially unlocking knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. But it was the direct encounter with the Shadow Man that occupied her thoughts most intensely. They had all seen it, not just her in dreams or imagination, but a physical manifestation witnessed by 5 people simultaneously. Whatever the Shadow Realm was, it was real in some fundamental sense, and now they had irrefutable evidence of its existence. As she drifted toward sleep, Emily wondered what this meant for their understanding of reality itself. If a parallel realm had existed alongside our own throughout history, occasionally intersecting and influencing events, how many other aspects of existence might still remain beyond human perception or comprehension? Her dreams that night were different, clearer, more coherent, as if a barrier had been removed. She found herself in the shadow realm again, but now she could perceive it with greater definition, seeing details and structures that had been obscured before. The Shadow Man approached, but he was not alone. Other figures moved with him, some resembling him in their tall, thin darkness, others with different forms but all clearly natives of this realm of shadows. "You have found the archive," the Shadow Man said, his thoughts flowing into her mind with greater clarity than before. "The record left by the Watchers of Oakwood for those who would come after them." "The Watchers?" Emily asked. "Who were they?" Humans who learned to perceive our realm and took it upon themselves to monitor the boundary between worlds, he explained. They established their settlement at Oakwood because they recognized it as a place where the veil was thin, where transition could occur more easily. For generations, they maintained their vigil, documenting their observations and preserving knowledge that most of humanity had forgotten or rejected. And Thomas Miller was one of them? The last of the original line, the Shadow Man confirmed, though others with the ability have appeared periodically without connection to the founding families. The capacity to perceive beyond ordinary limitations sometimes emerges spontaneously, particularly in locations near the seams between realms. Like me? Emily asked, a question that had been forming in her mind since her dreams began. Yes, came the simple reply. Your arrival in Oakwood was not coincidental, though you may have thought it was. You were drawn here because of your latent ability to perceive the boundary, an ability that has strengthened since you discovered the first photograph. Emily considered this, trying to reconcile it with her understanding of her own life and choices. Had some unconscious perception guided her decision to accept the position at the Oakwood Historical Society? Had she somehow sensed the thin boundary without realizing it? The book we found today, she said, returning to more immediate concerns. What does it contain? The accumulated knowledge of centuries of observation and interaction, the Shadow Man replied. Instructions for safely crossing the threshold, maps of other locations where the boundary is thin, records of shadow beings who have established contact with humans throughout history, a pause, and warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled crossing, the harm that can come to both realms if the boundary is breached carelessly or with ill intent. The time of thinning you mentioned before, Emily recalled. Is that why you've guided us to this knowledge now? Because the boundaries are becoming more permeable? Precisely, the shadow being confirmed. The cycle has returned to a point where interaction between realms will increase, whether prepared for or not. Better that it be understood and managed by those with knowledge than left to chance and misinterpretation. The dreamscape shifted, and Emily found herself standing before what appeared to be a vast map of the world, with lines of light tracing across its surface. The seams where boundaries thinned, connecting points across continents and oceans. Oakwood is just one node in a greater network, the Shadow Man explained. There are others who maintain similar watches at other thin points. Some have preserved ancient knowledge, others have rediscovered it through their own experiences. The time approaches when these scattered guardians will need to reconnect, to share what they know and prepare for increased transition between realms. Before Emily could ask more questions, the dream began to fade, the shadow realm receding as consciousness returned. But the Shadow Man's final message lingered in her mind as she awoke. You have a choice to make, Emily Thornton. How deeply you wish to involve yourself in what is coming. But know that whatever you decide, the thinning of boundaries will continue. The question is not whether worlds will meet, but how that meeting will be understood and managed. The following week passed in a blur of intensive research and documentation. Dr. Reeves made remarkable progress translating the larger book they had discovered, revealing a comprehensive history of interactions between the human world and the shadow realm stretching back centuries. Professor Harmon's analysis of the additional artifacts confirmed properties similar to those they had found in Thomas Miller's collection, objects that somehow existed according to the physics of both realms simultaneously, retaining characteristics that defied conventional scientific explanation. Emily and Marcus continued their field research, identifying and documenting more locations along Oakwood's seam, where the boundary between worlds appeared particularly thin. At each site, they found evidence that previous generations had recognized its significance. Subtle markers, architectural features designed to create specific shadow patterns, or hidden symbols incorporated into the structure. Mrs. Miller provided invaluable historical context, connecting their discoveries with stories and legends that had been passed down through Oakwood's oldest families. What had seemed like local folklore or superstition now revealed itself as a tradition of knowledge preserved through generations, disguised as tales to avoid persecution during times when such perceptions were condemned as witchcraft or heresy. As their understanding deepened, Emily continued to experience dreams of the shadow realm, each more vivid and informative than the last. The Shadow Man and others of his kind shared knowledge that complemented and expanded what they were learning from the book and artifacts, creating a more complete picture of the relationship between realms. One rainy afternoon, as they gathered in Professor Harmon's office to share their latest findings, The professor raised a question that had been increasingly on all their minds. "We need to discuss how much of this knowledge should be shared more widely," he said, his tone serious. "We've confirmed the existence of a parallel realm and documented evidence of interaction between worlds. Under normal circumstances, this would be a revolutionary scientific discovery worthy of publication in the most prestigious journals. But these aren't normal circumstances," Dr. Reeves pointed out. "The book contains explicit warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled crossing between realms, psychological harm to the unprepared, potential disruption to both worlds if the boundary is breached carelessly, not to mention the likelihood that mainstream science would reject our findings regardless of the evidence," Marcus added pragmatically. "Without experiencing what we've experienced, most would dismiss our conclusions as delusion or misinterpretation. There's also the question of respecting the traditions of those who have guarded this knowledge for generations," Emily said, thinking of the careful way the information had been preserved and hidden. "They chose to keep it restricted for reasons that we're only beginning to understand. My grandfather used to say that the shadow realm wasn't meant for everyone to perceive," Mrs. Miller offered quietly. "That some minds couldn't accommodate the shift in perspective without harmful consequences. He believed the ability to see beyond the ordinary world was a gift that came with responsibility, the responsibility to protect both realms from misunderstanding and fear." They debated the issue for hours, weighing scientific openness against potential risks, the advancement of knowledge against the wisdom of caution. In the end, they reached a compromise approach. They would document everything thoroughly for preservation in secure archives, available to future researchers under appropriate oversight, while publishing only carefully selected findings that would advance scientific understanding without revealing the full extent of what was possible. "A middle path," Professor Harmon summarized. "Neither complete suppression nor unrestricted revelation, but thoughtful stewardship of knowledge that could transform human understanding of reality itself." As their meeting concluded, Emily found herself standing at the window, watching rain create patterns of light and shadow on the university grounds below. The world looked the same as it always had, yet her perception of it had fundamentally changed. Shadows were no longer merely the absence of light, but potential gateways to another realm of existence, one that had been there all along, occasionally intersecting with human experience in ways that had been misunderstood, mythologized, or simply overlooked. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Miller asked, joining her at the window. "Now that you know what you know, see what you see?" Emily considered the question carefully. The Shadow Man had told her she had a choice to make about her level of involvement in the coming time of thinning, when boundaries between realms would become more permeable. She could document and observe from a scholarly distance, or she could engage more directly with the process, perhaps even learning to cross the threshold herself, as the book described. "I think I'll continue what Thomas Miller began," she said finally. "Observing the boundary, documenting the interactions, perhaps helping others understand when they have experiences they can't explain." She turned to the elderly woman. "Your grandfather chose to remain in our world while maintaining awareness of the shadow realm. That seems like a balanced approach, neither denying the reality of what he perceived nor abandoning his human life to pursue it exclusively." Mrs. Miller nodded approvingly. He would be pleased to know his work is continuing, that his experiences weren't just stories, but the beginning of a greater understanding. That evening, as Emily walked home through Oakwood, she found herself newly attuned to the subtle signs of the boundary's presence, the way shadows lingered slightly longer than they should in certain locations, the almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere near the seam that ran through town. Once noticed, these phenomena seemed obvious, making her wonder how she had ever missed them before. Near the old bridge, she paused, watching as twilight deepened and shadows stretched across the water. In the gathering darkness, she thought she glimpsed movement, not just one shadow figure but several, moving along the riverbank where the boundary was thinnest. They didn't approach or interact with her, simply went about their own purposes in their own realm, occasionally visible to those with eyes to see. Emily smiled, thinking of the little boy who had stood for a photograph on his 8th birthday in 1910, smiling proudly as a being from another realm made its presence known in his shadow. That moment, captured on film and preserved for nearly a century, had initiated a journey of discovery that was still unfolding, a gradual revelation of worlds existing alongside one another, occasionally touching, each with its own marvels and mysteries. As night fell completely over Oakwood, Emily turned toward home, carrying with her the knowledge that reality was vaster and more complex than humanity had imagined, and that somewhere in the darkness that surrounded her, shadows moved with purpose and awareness, conscious entities in a realm parallel to her own. The photograph that had started it all, a seemingly minor anomaly noticed during a routine digitization project, had opened a door to understanding that would continue to expand as she and her colleagues carefully explored the implications of what they had discovered. And somewhere in the shadow realm, the being who had first appeared to Thomas Miller continued to observe, to guide, and occasionally to reach across the thinning boundary between worlds. In the years that followed, Emily became known in certain circles as a specialist in what she carefully termed anomalous shadow phenomena, a designation vague enough to avoid unwanted attention, but specific enough that those who needed her expertise could find her. She documented dozens of cases similar to Thomas Miller's, photographed shadow anomalies at thin points around the world, and quietly helped those who had experienced shadow realm encounters understand what they had perceived. The book discovered in the old meeting house proved to be an invaluable guide, its translated contents providing context and instruction for navigating the increasingly permeable boundary between worlds. Just as the Shadow Man had predicted, incidents of crossing began to increase, subtle at first, but growing more frequent as the time of thinning progressed. Professor Harmon established a small research institute dedicated to studying these phenomena, operating discreetly under the official banner of boundary physics, a term that attracted little attention from mainstream science while allowing them to continue their work with appropriate resources and protection. Dr. Reeves completed her translation of both the journal and the larger book, creating a comprehensive reference that became the foundation for their understanding of interrealm dynamics. Marcus, whose initial skepticism had given way to scholarly fascination, focused his research on the historical aspects of shadow realm interaction, documenting evidence of awareness of the boundary throughout human civilization, from prehistoric cave paintings to medieval manuscripts to modern accounts disguised as fiction or folklore. Mrs. Miller, though she passed away peacefully several years after their discoveries, left her family's artifacts and records to the Institute, ensuring that her grandfather's legacy would continue to inform their understanding of the shadow realm. And through it all, the photograph of young Thomas Miller on his 8th birthday in 1910 remained a touchstone, a moment captured in time when a camera had accidentally documented what human eyes often missed, the presence of another realm existing alongside our own, occasionally revealing itself to those with the perception to see it. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial light and digital screens, shadows had become easy to ignore, mere absences, negative spaces given little thought or attention. But for those who knew to look more carefully, they remained what they had always been: boundaries between worlds, thresholds where different states of existence touched and occasionally crossed, reminders that reality was more mysterious and magnificent than most would ever know. The little boy who had smiled so proudly for the camera all those years ago, unaware that the shadow behind him didn't quite match, had initiated a journey of discovery that continued to unfold, a gradual revelation of worlds within worlds, each with its own wonders waiting to be perceived by those with eyes to see beyond ordinary limitations. And somewhere in the spaces between light and darkness, in the realm where shadows had substance and consciousness, the beings who had watched humanity throughout history continued their patient observation, occasionally reaching across the thinning boundary to those rare individuals who could perceive their presence, leaving evidence of their existence for those who would come after, signals across the threshold between worlds.